Good morning and welcome to the 18th meeting of 2025 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have received apologies today from Rhoda Grant. Our first agenda item is to agree to take agenda items 5 and 6 in private. Agenda item 5 is the consideration of a work programme paper, and item 6 is consideration of the evidence taken by the committee on its pre-budget scrutiny this morning. Our members agreed to take these items in private. We're agreed, thank you. Our second agenda item this morning is evidence, excuse me. Our second agenda item this morning is evidence taking on our pre-budget scrutiny. This is the third and final year of the committee's agreed focus on human rights budgeting and the final budget of Session 6. And accordingly, the focus will be on accountability and consolidating the committee's scrutiny over the session. This follows on from the committee exploring participation in 2023 for pre-budget 2024-25 scrutiny and transparency in 2024 for our pre-budget 25-26 scrutiny. Although this is the committee's first public session this year on pre-budget scrutiny, the committee has held informal sessions, and last week we had with the Commission advocating rights for minorities. The committee will be drawing heavily on what it heard from the Commission last week. This morning we will be hearing from key stakeholders the committee has worked with throughout the session before hearing from the Minister for Equalities and Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government. The first session will take place in a roundtable format, and I would like to welcome Professor Angela O'Hagan, Chair, Scottish Human Rights Commission, Emma Congreve, Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group and Deputy Director and Principal Knowledge Exchange Fellow, Fraser of Allender Institute, and Sarah Cowan, Director, Scottish Women's Budget Group, and Alan Faulds, Senior Policy Officer, Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland. You're all very welcome this morning. Thank you for coming. I'm going to begin our conversation this morning by inviting everyone to very briefly introduce themselves. And I will begin. I'm Karen Adam. I'm the MSP for Banffshire and Buchan Coast, and I'm the convener of this committee. And I'll work round anti-clockwise.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Angela O'Hagan. I'm the Chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission and formerly the Independent Chair of the Scottish Government Equality Human Rights Budgets Advisory Group. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Pam Gosso. I'm a member of the Scottish Parliament for the West Region and for the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party.
Good morning. I'm Emma Congreve. I am the interim chair of the Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group, as well as being deputy director of the Fraser of Allender Institute.
Morning. Thanks for having me. I'm Alan Faulds, Senior Policy Officer at the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland.
Hi, I'm Marie McNair, MSP. I represent Clybank and Mulgai constituency.
Tess White, MSP North East Region.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cowan, the Director at the Scottish Women's Budget Group.
Good morning, I'm Paul McLennan. I'm the MSP for East Lothian.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to kick off with our questions, but please do indicate if you want to come in to answer anything, and members also if you want to come in with your questions or any supplementaries on anything that's said. Firstly, I'm going to ask what yourselves as stakeholders, what were your aspirations and expectations for the Scottish Government's progress towards taking a human rights budgeting approach over the course of this parliamentary session, and do you feel that they've been met? Emma, would you like to?
So I can start talking on behalf of the Equality Human Rights Budget Advisory Group. And Angela can correct me when I'm wrong, but at the start of this parliamentary term, there was a set of recommendations that went from, I'll call it airbag for short, to the Scottish Government on a range of factors around equality and human rights budgeting. And a lot of those recommendations are still waiting for real progress to be made. We had a government response I think it was over 2 years after those recommendations went in. So that in itself was quite frustrating. And the response that came back did take on board a lot of what was asked for, and an action plan and tracking of actions was put in place. But I suppose over the last year, on review of the progress that has been made with Airbag's recommendations over the parliamentary term, it was things have come to a head a little bit in terms of determining that the progress that members, particularly the external members of Airbag, because it's a group that involves both internal civil servants as well as external stakeholders, particularly from external stakeholders, although we can see a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of thinking has gone into how to take forward the recommendations. The kind of the evidence of progress has been more limited. We are in the process of not having a permanent chair at the moment. It was recruiting for a permanent chair was unsuccessful earlier this year, with none of the external members of Airbag putting themselves forward for that permanent chair role. And I think this comes back to the theme of today on accountability. So with progress not being made on some of the recommendations in terms of changing practices within how budgets are made in government, it was felt that frustration in terms of, well, who is accountable for this? Why has there been a lack of progress, and what does that mean for a group like Airbag in terms of its role? So I think that's important to state up front that we do feel that there is a lack of progress, and I think a lot of that is tied up with who is accountable for ensuring that progress is being made over time.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Alan?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly been clear progress in terms of the Scottish Government's willingness to talk about human rights as part of its sort of framing for budget decisions. You've seen some warm words and definitely progress in certain areas, but I think maybe the focus has been on the spending side of the budget and not so much on revenue raising. So there's a lot of recognition that, for example, social security is a human right, which is very welcome. There's a lot of talk about sort of human rights with regards to health and to social care. Again, all of that is very positive, but you then find that kind of caveated with, well, of course, we're operating within difficult financial circumstances, and part of human rights budgeting is making sure, a part of a human rights-based approach is making sure that you're making maximum use of available resources. And I suppose there's a question about whether or not there has been a willingness on the part of the Scottish Government to investigate how it can use revenue-raising powers to then meet sort of its spending, its sort of ideal spending envelope in these sort of areas. So yes, we're talking about human rights in terms of the spend, but are we doing it in terms of actually making sure we're raising those revenues? So I suppose that's where progress is maybe limited from our perspective.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to come in on that? Yeah, Sarah.
I suppose building on Emma's points as well, I'm also an external member of the Equalities and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group, and we look at the human rights budgeting, but also as the Scottish Women's Budget Group, we're particularly focused on gender budgeting. And the two forms of budgeting highlight the need for outcome-focused budgets and for progress to be monitored against these outcomes. And I think when looking at the recommendations around the processes within the budgets that Emma was talking about and the recommendations made from Airbag, some of those process ones that really focused on becoming outcome focused are the ones that there's not really seen any progress on. In particular, the kind of strong connection between National Performance Framework, Programme for Government and budgets, and to see these documents tying through to each other. And from our point of view, greater clarity and connection between those would potentially help in reviewing work to tackle what's termed the implementation gap as well, and how the budget is trying to progress the set outcomes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Angela, please.
Thank you. I mean, just very briefly, I think colleagues have captured most of what I would have said and certainly agree with. I think For me, running through the comments here is the gap between narrative and practice. And the EBAG recommendations or airbag recommendations were made some time ago and made in concert with the officials whose responsibility it is to implement them. But the very slow progress on not just the EBAG recommendations, but alongside that, the very limited progress on the mainstreaming strategy and the revision of the public sector equality duty, and then, of course, the resiling from the Human Rights Bill have all sort of undermined momentum, I think, around the budget process, where, as colleagues have said, there's been a focus on process rather than content, meaning that the outcomes desired by the combination of resources to achieve government policy objectives are not being tied together in a way that certainly through EBAG and from the Scottish Human Rights Commission and other external members, including the Scottish Women's Budget Group, we've said for a number of years that there's a lack of fluency between the National Performance Framework, the budget and annual programmes for government, seeing that continuity of how resources are raised, as Alan has said, to be allocated to achieve policy objectives. And the practice is not yet there, where human rights impact assessments or human rights analysis, human rights and equality analysis, still continue to be a bit of an add-on rather than a way of thinking and doing in policy making, and the relationship between resource allocation and generation in that process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Very helpful. We're now going to move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, and sorry I can't join you in person, but greetings from sunny Dundee this morning. Angela, can I come to you first? You talked about this gap between narrative and practice and the lack of fluency, and I suppose that's one of the reasons why the committee started this process was to try and identify the sort of how we could join up those gaps. What would be your sort of analysis or your understanding of why there is still those gaps, why there's still that lack of fluency that you described?
I think there's a number of factors there. Good morning, Maggie. I think there's a number of factors. I think we still have a capacity gap within government and perhaps within Parliament as well, in terms of the knowledge of and application of the analytical tools to draw in appropriate data, to interpret data and data gaps from an equalities and human rights perspective, to then apply that human rights analysis into policy making and budget allocation. I think, as I've possibly said to this committee before, there's it depends on the degree of tolerance or the level of quality assurance and what's acceptable within different directorates in terms of how well the equality and human rights analysis are discharged at department level. I think there needs to be increased scrutiny at cabinet level of policies and proposals coming forward, and similarly increased scrutiny by Parliament as well. While the committee's focus on participation and transparency are very welcome, and you're moving now into accountability, that accountability has to be consistently applied, not just by this committee, but across committees in the Parliament in relation to the extent to which duty bearers are meeting their human rights obligations. And that includes, as Alan has said, our resources being maximised in such a way as minimum core obligations are being realised. So, and the other thing is about narrative and there being a human rights narrative across government. We have a narrative, as Alan has said, there's a strong narrative about X or Y policy being a human rights-based approach, but that's not then followed through into how resources are generated and allocated. And it's that integration of that human rights-based approach as a way of thinking and doing government that I think has still to get there, really. I think there is certainly positive intention and positive will, but it's not yet integrated as a
Thanks very much for that, Angela. That's helpful. And yeah, I suppose it is that. It's that frustration, isn't it, of the lack of joining those things up in that way. Alan, if I can come to you, you talked about the tensions, I suppose, between revenue generation, resource generation, and allocation, but also around some of the priorities that the Alliance would have in health and social care. How have you seen over the course of the discussions over this parliamentary session, have those priorities changed at all when we're talking about how we fund, how we resource, how we determine those priorities for services, for outcomes? Have you seen a shift in those?
So I don't think I've seen a shift in terms of what certainly government and what Parliament wants to sort of invest its resources in. So, there has been sort of recognition, particularly obviously of serious significant importance to us as investment in social care. And there has been recognition in Parliament of the need to invest in social care. We've seen increases to, for example, the minimum pay for social care workers, which is very important. I'm sure Sarah could talk at length about the sort of the gendered implications of sort of low pay in that area. But again, that's where perhaps there is that gap between sort of the narrative and the reality on the ground, as Angela Hagan is talking about. So thinking about the fact that we started off this term in social care with the independent review of adult social care, which was very clear about the need for a human rights-based approach to social care and the need for quite significant reform, and that was sort of taken up by the Scottish Government in the form of the National Care Service Bill, as was. By the time that bill completed its passage, it had, of course, become the Care Reform Bill, and effectively what had started out as a human rights-based attempt to reform social care, to deliver on a service that would be more dignified for people accessing that service, more dignified for people working in it, became effectively a conflict between the Scottish Government and COSLA over where powers should lie. So what started as a human rights-based focus became a sort of a territorial scrap between different layers of government as to who should have what powers, and that human rights focus was lost. So I don't think the priority changed, but I think the way we talked about these things changed, and I think the Alliance certainly found it very disappointing that we went from that recognition that people's human rights were really being quite severely breached in social care. People were not getting access to the care they needed, that care wasn't the quality that they deserved, and on to just like, well, it's about who has the powers and who has the money, and that I think was quite frustrating.
No, and I suppose, I mean, I hear that frustration, and I think it's well expressed by lots of people in across the social care sector, from service users to providers. I suppose do you or do other panel members, have you seen a similar kind of frustration in the priorities are still there, the priorities to deliver on our human rights outcomes still being there, but given that shift in that piece of legislation, given the loss of the Human Rights Bill, is there? Do you think that the government actually has the understanding, as well as the questions of capacity and narrative that Angela spoke about, the understanding of how to connect those aspirations to delivery? Are we missing something? Obviously, Alan, you spoke there about the territorial scrap between national and local government, but is there something? I seem to get the feeling that we know what we want to do, we just really don't know how to, and other things get in the way. We will focus on the territorial scrap because actually the other question is too hard to answer, and I wonder if you get a sense of that as well.
So a little bit, and I think actually it relates to some of the stuff Angela had said about how there's that, I think Sarah as well, that there's lack of sort of connection between the different parts of sort of the budget process and the different parts of government. I think that one of the points I'd sort of had listed for potentially a discussion later on is kind of the idea that there are certain areas of Scottish Government activity and spending, so social care, as we've said, social security, also maybe to a little bit sort of housing perhaps, where there's an increasing understanding of human rights, but that exists, as Angela was saying, within those specific policy areas and those specific portfolios, and it doesn't then feed out through to the wider budget process, so that the whole Scottish Government is taking that whole approach where human rights are understood to be relevant to everything, and the whole budget has to work towards achieving those rights. And I think that's where that connection isn't really there yet. There's some areas where human rights are really recognised and some where not so much, and it's not a coherent whole, it doesn't feel like yet.
Thanks, Alan. Emma, do you want to point. Sorry, Karen, does somebody else want to come in?
No, that's okay. Emma had indicated and Sarah also.
Great.
Yeah, so I will say one thing that has changed recently with regards to responsibilities for the Equality and Human Rights, or is it still called the Equality and Fair Scotland budget statement? So that activity that happens around the budget, so that has recently moved, or is in the process of moving from the Equalities part of government into the Exchequer. And I think that's positive because that is that recognition that the Exchequer function within government needs to grasp this and take a role in coordinating, which is very much their role at the moment, but really understanding how the process of bringing together the human rights aspects of the budget and equalities, but it's still in terms of who sort of is responsible for identifying the human rights and equalities aspects of programmes and policy change. That is still seen to be the responsibility of sort of local areas of the government. So whilst we have now had a shift for the coordination function into Exchequer, which I do think is a positive shift, we'll have to see over time whether it makes a big difference to the focus and the quality of the evidence that is used as part of the budget. I think we still have an issue that the responsibility is still for individual ministers and individual cabinet secretaries spread across the government. And again, this comes back to the theme of accountability. So you have it's not. I do agree with Angela that there are some capacity issues, but I think more overriding that is the prioritisation part of things. So who is in which areas of government is this being prioritised? And as Alan said, some areas are more further forward than this than others. But it needs to be, I think, there's a structural element to this. And I think this comes back to things the government has talked about, for example, in its public service reform strategy, about how it is difficult to integrate approaches across government. We see it in this example of equality and human rights budgeting, but for many other areas of big strategic policy push as well. And the reality is that it's very difficult to do. And I think we do need to acknowledge that different methods are tried, but we need to do a bit more learning and understand where we haven't been successful and work out what needs to change. But I think a lot of that is structural, and I think that is at quite senior level of government in terms of DGs and at the ministerial and cabinet secretary level. I mean, we've seen huge efforts put in by more junior civil servants in trying to make progress, but they are buffeted by constraints that come their way. And that's partly the nature of politics, but it's also the nature of how the Scottish Government is structured and how things like this are prioritised.
Thanks very much for that, Emma. Sarah, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, just I guess building on the social care question and Alan's response as well. With a bit of an example, I guess, where this narrative and practice disconnect comes. In last year's budget, it had been announced that the Scottish Government had met a commitment to raise social care funding by 25% from the commitment made in 2021. But that announcement kind of failed to outline any detail around if that current funding was meeting needs, how the spend was working to tackle inequalities that are perpetuated by lack of quality care, and how rising costs have impacted what the meaning of that commitment in the first place, having been made kind of before the high inflation really impacted. So that commitment sits really at odds with people's experience and with practice at local government, where charges for social care are rising and the amount people are having to pay to access social care support is going up, as well as eligibility criteria tightening. So when people are having that experience but hearing those kind of announcements from government, where's the accountability within that to the experience that people are having? So kind of clear communications are going to be critical and maybe sometimes that will mean, and I know that won't be politically as good, but sometimes recognising that, you know, the change in circumstances since 2021 means that good news that the commitment was met, but we know that now it's not enough and we have to go further. And there's nothing within it of other commitments made, such as ending charges on non-residential care. No detail on that from government. So people are still left waiting, thinking, is this going to come in by the end of the parliamentary term? It looks very, very unlikely. So clear communications as part of that accountability is really critical.
Thanks very much, folks. I suppose my last question is just really, have there been any policy priorities that you would have expected to have seen some progress on? You know, even if it's only narrative progress, are there policy changes that you would have wanted to see that you haven't seen in the course of the sort of 4 year conversation about human rights budgeting? I don't know who wants to take that.
Okay. Emma's indicated.
Thanks, Emma.
I'll just speak about this as this is with my Fraser Allender hat on. And within the papers for today, there was a link to a report on human rights budgeting that was done by a former colleague at Fraser Allender Institute on fellowship, when he was on a fellowship here at the Parliament. And he now works here, but it's quite complicated. But that was done around, I think it's 2021, around that time. And the example that he looked at on human rights budgeting for that was people with learning disabilities. And that is one area which we work on a lot at the Fraser Allender Institute. And there has been, I would say, very little progress for a group of people whose human rights are probably the most neglected. Out of any group of disabled people in particular, you know, we still have people who are in effectively locked up in secure units when they, you know, denying so many of their human rights when there's no medical need for them to be there. It's the fact that they can't, the social care part of the system cannot meet their needs in the community. So I think that's really interesting because that was a case study in that report that was done for, I think it was for this committee, and there has been no progress there. And we saw there was a bill for the LDAN bill, Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence bill, which would have put in place some of what we were looking for in terms of clarifying in legislation what's some of the changes that needed to happen. But that bill was, of course, shelved. Same time as a human rights bill, and despite there being promises that there would still be a process put forward in terms of draft legislation, we have not heard anything on that in the last year. So I think that's one particular example where we feel is very clearly not been the progress that was desperately required.
Angela has indicated, Maggie.
Thank you, Convener. Thanks, Maggie. To follow on from Emma's point there, the Scottish Human Rights Commission produced a spotlight on learning disabilities earlier this year. And one of the things I think to highlight in the context of this discussion, in addition to the points that Emma has made about individuals being locked into inappropriate care settings, is how difficult it has been to follow the money. The lack of transparency in how resources have been dispensed and discharged from the £20 million Coming Home budget to support the implementation of the Coming Home implementation plan. And I think that gives rise to concerns, I'm not suggesting malfeasance there, but what I am suggesting is that it's very difficult to follow the money. And we see that across the budget documents as well, where there are positive policy commitments across a whole range of issues. And I think it would, it is that they have to be recognised around social security, the promise, violence against women and girls, etc. And that includes the strategic review. But what we don't then see is greater transparency coming through in the budget documentation that makes it possible to drill into how has spending been allocated, to whom, in what way and with what outcome. And that picks up on Sarah's points really about outcomes and that linkage between intent and outcomes not being as transparent as it might be. And I think that's partly about understanding, partly about the understanding of how to articulate and partly a lack of implementing some of the know-how that we have, certainly in previous years and continuing. I understand there's meant to be an intergovernmental meeting sometime soon on human rights and equality budgeting. We've brought in lots of examples from international governments where different approaches to human rights budgeting, equalities budgeting, gender budgeting have been taken. So the tools are there. Yes, it's complicated, but they're managing to do it, or at least make further inroads in other countries with similar budget sizes. So I think it is a question of that the policy intent has to be underpinned by appropriate tools and clear political direction, and clear direction that is followed up and followed through by management within government. And that's Emma's point about what happens at directorate level, senior directorate level and cabinet level. If policy proposals and spending proposals are coming forward that don't have the possibility to identify how money is being allocated and what outcomes are anticipated, then that's a process failure that I think we need to address.
Maggie? Apologies, Maggie, I couldn't hear what you said there.
So, sorry, I muted myself to cough and then realised I couldn't unmute myself. Thanks, Karen. I'll leave it there. Happy to pass on, and I'll come in again if something else sparks a question. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. If I can start off with Angela, if I may, and it links on to the previous question from Maggie Chapman. And you've given a few concrete examples, but the question is, in your view, how has the progress against progressive realisation of human rights in Scotland been impacted by delays to strategy, policy and legislation, such as the decision to not implement revisions to the national outcomes or to not introducing the Human Rights Bill this session? These have been kicked down the road. So your view on that, please.
These are both an approach to incorporation of the international human rights obligations through a human rights incorporation bill would have provided an enhanced framework for accountability and scrutiny. And similarly, the national outcomes. The Scottish Human Rights Commission has long argued that as well as mainstreaming human rights into the national outcomes and the process by which they are secured, there should be specific outcomes on rights realisation. So I think there's a combination of the delay to the legislation means there's a delay to those drivers. By having legislation that drives public authority, including local authorities, that duty bearer practice and expectation is missing. So that drive needs to come from Parliament, and it needs to come from government in the absence of legislation. Nonetheless, those obligations, those international treaty obligations to ensure the minimum core, the basic floor below which public services cannot fall, still need to be observed. And I think that's where there's a disconnect between the practice of duty bearers and public authorities who see human rights as an add-on rather than an integral part of setting their own objectives, their own delivery plans and measuring outcomes and ensuring that services are evaluated and assessed, and that includes appropriate complaints processes, etc., as part of improvement systems, all around focusing on rights realisation. And that's what we've been trying to do at the Scottish Human Rights Commission with the recent spotlight reports on economic, social and cultural rights, on the rights of learning disabled people, and and other work where we've taken the international frameworks and said, here's what's required of you as a duty bearer. Here are the gaps and the evidence that we've seen, for example, from the Highlands and Islands on economic, social and cultural rights. So, but that by providing that framework of these are the requirements and here are the gaps, duty bearers can see where they need to improve. So the frameworks are there. What we do have, I think, is an insufficient knowledge base to be able to bring that practice into the everyday practice of service design, delivery and measurement across public authorities.
And this, after this session, we've got the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister in front of this committee. And you said that basically there needs to be a drive from basically this committee, from Parliament, this committee and the Scottish Government. So in relation to the question, what would you like us to address when the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister come in front of us?
That human rights, taking a human rights-based approach has to be integral to all aspects of government decision-making, whether that's policy, setting policy objectives or spending objectives. And part of the accountability focus of this committee just now means that looking at how budget decisions are made, what impact might they have and what have they not had so far on rights. So that's about do you have the data to understand what the current situation is and where are rights not being realised and what needs to happen to secure that. There is a bottom line here, which is minimum core obligations. So are services adequate, accessible, available and of sufficient quality? That's the benchmark, and that's the benchmark by which this committee and any other committee of the Parliament needs to scrutinise duty bearers, including the Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government, we would argue, are encouraged to set policy in a way that ensures those minimum core obligations are met.
Thank you. And would any other panel member, Alan?
Yeah, so just thinking about your initial question about the policies that have effectively not been taken forward. So obviously, I won't repeat what Angela said about the Human Rights Bill, but obviously very disappointed, the Alliance and our members, that bill wasn't taken forward, something we were, I think, had invested a lot of time and energy into, and really disappointed to see that hasn't come forward. On the national outcomes, again, very disappointing. So the Alliance had been members of the campaign, the Scotland Cares campaign, which had campaigned for a national outcome in care. That had been accepted by the Scottish Government. That was a new draft national outcomes, and the fact that those sort of suddenly at quite short notice just went up in smoke and suddenly that they're not being taken forward raises questions. Well, what's happening to those outcomes? How will they direct Scottish Government spending and priorities in the future? And I think there's points that I've raised on behalf of the Alliance at other committees, I think the Finance Committee, about the disconnect between, for example, you had First Minister's priorities, and obviously those have changed with each successive First Minister, and then the national outcomes. And you were seeing the national outcomes in the budget, but then not in the First Minister's priorities and not in the programme for government. And then perhaps a really big one, that the thing that's been a particular concern for the Alliance, and Sarah picked this up earlier, is the lack of progress on social care charging. So that this was a commitment that in this term of Parliament the Scottish Government would end non-residential social care charges. That looks very unlikely to happen in this Parliament unless a rabbit's pulled out of the hat in this final budget, which we would of course love to see and would be very grateful if it was. But it would be bad enough that hasn't been met if charges were at a standstill, but they're not. They've increased quite significantly. I think, for example, in Glasgow, 50% or more. And there's an inevitable consequence there of if people cannot access that care because they can no longer afford it, that's clearly breaching their human rights, their ability to sort of live independently and to have the highest attainable standard of health. But also it means that people who are still able to afford those end up in deeper poverty because they are paying more money. So that's one area where I think a failure to deliver on a very clearly made commitment that was given for completion this term is having really severe impacts on people's human rights.
Okay. Shall I go on to the next question? Okay, my next question, if I can start off with Emma. Emma, in your view, and we talked about in fact, the feedback that we've been given this morning is there is a gap, and I quote Angela, between narrative and practice. And that is, we hear these words, and it's actually quite damning to say that one thing is said, but nothing happens, and then things are kicked down the road. So my question, does the Scottish Government's positive narrative in the Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement and budget responses to the committee reflect reality, both in terms of policy impact and the changes that it has made to budget processes, data and documentation? You smile.
It's a big question, that. So I think we must recognise that having a strong positive narrative is helpful, because it does, it's that mood music to which it gives people permission to push forward on these areas that are really important. So we see more, when you have that positive narrative, you see more action happening than would be the case without that narrative. I think we must say that's true. Again, I understand how difficult it is to implement changes within a government structure. I'm a former civil servant, so I've seen it firsthand. And ultimately, you're dealing with a lot of different people, with a lot of different priorities, often being pulled in different directions. So if you're trying to if you're really trying to affect change, it requires a big shift in what's prioritised. And ultimately, you have to do less of one thing and more of another. Or you have to increase the resources that are going towards whatever you're doing, which has a trade-off somewhere. And I think that's the issue that most people within government trying to work on this are grappling with on a day-to-day basis. So they are not necessarily knowing what to prioritise and when. And again, I think that comes back to the direction set at directorate and cabinet level in terms of what is the most important thing here. So ultimately, that means we see very slow progress on a lot of those issues that are fundamental to human rights budgeting. I think transparency is what you covered last year, but in terms of progress that has been made to make budgets more accessible and more transparent has been very slow compared to what we know the government could be doing in terms of making it much clearer what spending is looking like year to year and what choices have been made, and then that allows much more questions to be asked and scrutiny of why. You need to know what has changed, and then you can try and dig into the why and do that scrutiny. I will say in last year's budget documentation, there was a big improvement in terms of at the level 4 budget level. There was much more information produced, both on what the budget was in the previous year and what the revisions had been in year. So you could actually look at what had been spent over the previous budget year up to the autumn revisions, and then compare that to what was in the budget for the following year. I don't think that necessarily came about because of recommendations from the likes of us as stakeholders, but nonetheless, it's a positive move. But that's still so much more that could be done on that transparency part of things. One of the biggest telling signs for me in that those involved in the budget are not on top of understanding outcomes and what's working is that, and I'll say this as meetings we've had as the Fraser Allender Institute, stakeholders often get asked this question, oh, what areas do you think could be cut? And for Scottish Government officials to be asking us that question, actually they should know the answer to that question, because they should have that understanding of what the budget spend is achieving and what outcomes are being achieved, where the value for money is, where changes could be made in terms of better value for money. And that requires a lot of evaluation. It requires a lot of scrutiny internally over what is being achieved with the budget spend from year to year. And that was within some of the airbag recommendations that throughout the year, and really understanding what the impact of the budget spend or changes in budget spend have been. So we are so the fact we get asked that question as stakeholders, when actually we should be the ones asking the government. So what evidence are you going to use to decide what's is going to change in the next budget? It really should be flipped. And trade-offs do need to be made. And one of the things we tried to work with officials on last year, ahead of the 25-26 budget, was for the Equality and Fair Scotland budget statement to actually have a section that looked at trade-offs, that looked at an area where spending wasn't increasing, that was decreasing, because you have to, budgets have to do that. You balance the budget, some areas go up, some areas go down. And that wasn't feasible to be produced as part of the budget documentation for the Equality Fair Scotland budget statement. We might get there next year, but it's, again, priorities being pulled in different directions. I think that's at the root of what I think why we've not got more progress here.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, convener, I'll pass back to you. Thank you, Emma.
Okay. Thank you. I think Sarah would like to come in on this.
If it's okay to come in on that question. An area I think that sits across kind of policy impact and budget processes to consider with regards to accountability is also how accountability between Scottish Government and delivery partners sits. How money that's committed and given to go to delivery partners, how it's working towards the intended outcomes. And again, that's why the importance of outcome-focused budgeting is so important. But with significant amounts of money going to other partners, particularly, for example, local government, how can accountability be embedded through all stages of the budget process and with all governments? Because we find, as well as looking at national budgets, we look at local budgets and local budget processes. And there's several different examples of where there may have been Scottish Government commitments and committed funding, but that not always necessarily being spent in the way. For example, analysis that was done by the Coalition of Carers in Scotland looking at funds to support unpaid carers. And there was 26 £26 million less in budget commitments that they could try and trace. That was so a shortfall of 26 million in terms of going to that support. And again, that comes down to Angela's point on following the money and being able to follow the money. If we, as external stakeholders, can't follow the money, as parliamentarians aren't able to follow the money, to ensure that there is that accountability through the whole process. And just, I guess, to be clear, we're not necessarily saying all money needs to be more ring-fenced. There's important reasons for local flexibility, but there's important reasons to have the accountability across all levels of government as well. And there's several different examples of those sorts of commitment being made at national government level and then not following through. And again, that experience that therefore people have being so at odds to commitments that they feel they've heard at national government level.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we hear you loud and clear on those very, very important points. And the mood music can very, very quickly turn sour if there's no delivery. And even I read in the papers today about carers going on strike. You know, people, you know, in terms of had enough, that if they can't meet their basic needs. And then this point, Emma, that you made about the Pareto principle, which is focus on the few important ones. We've had example this morning of people locked up. We learnt in our committee of the huge percentage of women and girls who have learning difficulties being sexually assaulted. That just resonated loud and clear. The promise, social security and the violence against women and girls that was mentioned. So we do hear you loud and clear. And as I say, the next session is with the Minister and Cabinet Secretary, and it's our job to take what you've shared with us this morning and what we've heard over the last few months and present that basically to the Scottish Government. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there's no one else wanting to come in on that, I'll move on to questions from Paul, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Just to kind of follow up on the discussions we kind of had about following the money and accountability. And I want to read out, we had a meeting with Karen last week, and I want to read out one of the statements that was made by one of the participants. One of the biggest challenges, and it's a quote we faced, was ensuring that our voices translated into meaningful influence. As our panel's questions were put directly to the Minister, it was evident that translating these real change requires persistence, transparency and stronger accountability measures. And it comes back to the point I think you were making, Angela, in about the Scottish Government meeting, its core, minimum core responsibilities. The issue that came through quite strongly was around about there was a real lack of data to confirm that, kind of coming through, that reflected lived experience, and we've kind of heard of that today. That's not just in terms of the issues we've had with CAM, but obviously beyond that. And I'll probably come to yourself first of all, Angela. Is that indicative of other parts of the budget? Because we had a case study last week talking around about employability, and that came through quite strongly in terms of that. But I'm just wondering, in your experience, whether that's coming through in other parts of the budget in terms of that. And again, can you maybe just bring in two questions into that as well? Does that demonstrate that the minimum core is being met or not? Because the accountability issue came through really strongly last week, that the government were passing monies on, but didn't follow it to see where the outcomes were coming from. But I'll come to yourself first of all, Angela, if that's okay.
Thank you, Paul. And I think, that follows on very much from what Sarah's just been saying about and something that in my time at EBAG and since we were very focused on, that the bulk of the Scottish budget is discharged out of Scottish Government into a range of delivery partners. So where is the connection there, and where is the scrutiny there? What are the expectations? How are outcomes measured? How are gaps in outcome delivery and funding measured? And that was also, in terms of parliamentary scrutiny, the intended purpose of the pre-budget scrutiny process in which we're engaged just now, so that Parliament would engage in that forward and backward look. Where was money allocated, what the outcomes have been, and should money be reorientated in other ways. And a big part of being able to interpret all of that is having reliable, consistent and relevant data. And across any aspect, I think, of public service delivery, we do see inconsistencies in data in terms of who's collecting what data, how it's collected, the extent to which it's disaggregated by protected characteristics as relevant to the Equality Act, or the extent to which it's informing what we would need to have to do an effective human rights analysis around availability, accessibility, affordability and quality. And if you don't have the data, then how are you directing public resource? How are you directing policy objectives? So there needs to be a much, we've been talking about data well, as long as we've been talking about equality and human rights budgeting, which is the entire life of this Parliament, since it was created, and we still haven't got there. We see, such a lot of inconsistencies in so many different areas where agencies within the same public service, whether that's in terms of custody and detention, or whether that's in terms of violence against women, or whatever. There's a whole range where data is not accurate, is not consistent, and then it's about how data is used and understanding the role data plays for policymakers at whatever level to understand the interrelated nature of different policy areas. So, and this was again a focus of the employability case study that you mentioned, that interrelationship between housing, education, transport, access to healthcare, all having a bearing on employment and the ability where jobs are available, the ability of individuals or families to take up those job opportunities. And again, the Scottish Human Rights Commission spotlight on economic, social and cultural rights in the Highlands and Islands really demonstrated that interconnection. But it also demonstrated the remoteness of voice to power, which is where you started your comments, Paul.
I'll probably bring in other people, because I previously sat in the Social Justice Committee, and there was an inquiry into employability and the issues you mentioned about housing, transport, childcare was again came through. So it's an issue, I think, that's not just, I think I mentioned this last week, it's not just for this committee, it's for other committees as well, in terms of how do we follow the money. Emma, I don't know if you want to come in, or anybody else wants to come in just on that point as well, because I think it's learning lessons for this committee, but other committees in terms of how we follow the money as well, in terms of other budget areas.
I'll just talk briefly about an area that has been a focus of budgets, which is one of the current First Minister's priorities, tackling child poverty. And I undertook an exercise earlier this year where I tried to follow the money from all of the policies that have been in the 2 delivery plans to date on child poverty. And I wasn't able to follow that money properly using data in the public domain. And the Scottish Government's efforts to track spend on child poverty, which they update annually in their progress report, actually doesn't capture the full range, nor does it fully capture outturn spend as opposed to budgeted spend. So given that child poverty is probably the most visible priority in terms of the First Minister, and in terms of it's up there in most budgets we've seen, particularly this Parliament, in terms of it being a priority, we can't even follow the money there and don't understand what is being spent there, then that's, shows that for other areas of government, if it's impossible for child poverty, it's not going to be possible for other areas. So I think that's quite a telling example.
I noticed Aberlour's comments on that in the press this morning, similar issues, but I don't know if Alan wants to come in.
Yeah, so just a few points. So on the data side of things, so that's been quite a consistent call from the Alliance for many years, but the need to improve data gathering. So we need comprehensive, robust, intersectional, disaggregated equalities and human rights data, so we can understand what the impacts of policies are. That's not currently up to standard, and I think my colleagues know a bit more about that side of things than I do, and Angela, I think, has talked about it quite a bit, but it is very likely to be impacting on both the development and then the evaluation of policies. There's also a point about if we haven't clearly defined what our minimum core standards and obligations are in Scotland, which we haven't, then what are we measuring against? What are we measuring sort of the delivery of if we haven't defined those things? I think, referring back, I think it was to the committee's session on participation a couple of years ago, where I think it was Pam Duncan-Glancy had been referring to a then recent report about people with learning disabilities not being able to choose where they lived. And again, that's a theme we've had today about people being inappropriately institutionalised. If we've got a group of people in society who aren't able to have choice over where they can live, is that an appropriate? Is that an acceptable minimum core? We said that we accept there's a group we just allow that to not be the case for, so that's also obviously a problem. And then just again another point around sort of following the money and again sort of evidencing how policies work. So a point that's been raised repeatedly by carers organisations is the real difficulty of following Carers Act money. So there's millions going sort of effectively missing in between the Carers Act money that's given from the Scottish Government to councils and then actual implementation on the ground, and people can't see where that money is going. Again, if we don't have the data of how that Carers Act money is being used to make carers' lives better, we don't understand if that money is being used well and if people's lives are being made better.
Yep. And just to re-emphasise the points about the importance of the collection of, from our point of view, sex disaggregated data and intersectional data. And as Angela said, that's inconsistent across different areas of governments, with some areas collecting more data than others. But the crucial point is where the data is there, ensuring that it's being used and that it's not just being stated, as we sometimes see, but it's actually being analysed and then driving the decision making, because that's where the data, that's the importance of the data and why it's important to be used. And we've been recently undertaking a couple of different pieces of research around care, and it's an area which has so consistently been highlighted for the poor data quality within that area, and this has been highlighted for many years. So the need for data improvements in some areas which may be holding back changes in those areas as well is really critical.
Thanks, Camilla. That's me.
Okay,
yep.
Thank you. If I may, I would like to come in a question before we move on to Pam. Just taking in everything that you've said so far this morning and thinking about the demonstrating that minimum core could be met. When we look at equality impact assessments and how they work within all spheres of government, as a previous and another life, I was a local councillor, and we were always looking at the quality impact assessments at the end of any reports that were presented before us. And following on from what you were saying, Emma, in regards to, the structurally things aren't set up for what we're trying to do and achieve here. And I could see that structure doesn't include an equality impact assessment in those areas that we should be concerned with being able to feed into the building of services in the first place. And oftentimes these are add-on, and it costs additional money to add on, and when there are cutbacks, it's usually those that go first. So looking at how that can be changed, how that equality impact assessments, how they can be embedded into the structure of all spheres of government at the very beginning. How could you see that happening? Is that something that would be possible and would help with this human rights budgeting approach? Particularly, we're looking at accountability as well. When we look at, for example, local governments, there are some equality impact assessments I've seen, for example, with the closure of some sheltered housing complexes. But even then, when we see the detrimental impacts, where's the accountability when they still go ahead and do this? What rights do the people have? So it's the equality impact assessments really is the question. Where should they be sitting, and how much can they be used for that accountability?
So it's a question Airbag come back to frequently in our discussions, both within internal members of Airbag, and I think it's well understood, as you said, that EQIAs are often done as a add-on exercise rather than being integral, rather than being done at the start of the process and then being used to develop the policy that results. So, I mean, fundamentally, this comes back to how policy is made in the Scottish Government. And whilst there are examples where, an equality issue is at the forefront of trying to develop a policy, more often than not, it's about trying to, have a policy which delivers on a particular need or an outcome that's been identified, but that has not been done through an equality analysis. That's been done through a process of saying, oh, we need to do something about, say, housing policy. We need to build X amount of new homes. But, if it was done on an equality and human rights basis first, then the type of homes that were being built first would probably look quite different to the process that has gone through, which is about meeting a target, based on housing need, but ultimately not based on housing needs for equality groups. So I think it is going back to basics in terms of what is policy being made for? And a lot of this comes from, manifestos are a really key part of this, because if something's in a manifesto, then, that has to be done. So actually it's not just within the Scottish Government, it's within the parties that are developing manifestos and understanding them, having a better understanding of how to develop those manifesto proposals on an equality basis. And then there has to be more challenge within the policy-making environment when the government is in power. There has to be that expectation that there will be a pushback on the basis of have equality and human rights aspects being considered first rather than last. And at the moment, we don't really have, as far as I can understand the policy-making process, we don't have that challenge function that can step in and hold whoever needs to be held to account during the policy making process. By the time it gets to legislation and the Parliament is stepping in, arguably it's possibly too late, because the fundamentals have been set. Whilst changes can be made at that process, it's very important, and I think that there is more role there for scrutiny and challenge. It has to be in the foundations of how policies developed.
Thank you. Angela.
Thank you. I would agree with everything Emma has said, well, as a matter of course, but just in what Emma's been saying there. I think that point about what is policy being made for. Sometimes I think equality impact assessments, human rights impact assessments are a kind of misnomer because they're looking to, well, what impact will this policy have? You need to understand why the policy is being considered in the first place. What is the analysis of the so-called problem that policy is trying to address? And if policy making is always about resolving problems, then it kind of makes everything a problem rather than trying to create some kind of resolution to that. But I think, as Emma says, firstly, there needs to be appropriate tools that are usable, that are understandable by officials, by people trying to make policy and do that analysis in the first instance. And that comes back to Paul's point about data, available, reliable, consistent data. That is applied not in a mechanistic way, and that equality impact, human rights impact assessments have been lined up alongside environmental impact assessment, children's rights impact assessments, and then we get pushback from officials, not just in Scotland but elsewhere, saying, well, this just results in a kind of cognitive overload and it's too much pressure on the policy-making process. I completely disagree with that, because if the policy process, if the intent of policy in terms of the shared political objectives round this table as well, in any kind of cross-party situation, rather in the cross-party context, the intention is for better life outcomes for the population over which government governs and Parliament represents. The intention is a better life for all. So the drive then needs to be to see these different tools as all pointing in the same direction, whether that's human rights, environmental rights, children's rights, equalities analysis. They should all be part of the policy process. And that's about understanding what difference will X policy make on Y issue as experienced by ABC in the population, and then resources are allocated to policy objectives that align with that analysis, and then the evaluation follows through. And that's what the OECD, for example, has consistently articulated and directly to the Scottish Government in terms of gender budgeting and other forms of equality budgeting, that there should be that ex ante analysis, so the initial early analysis, the concurrent, so how are things working out in the way that the policy has been designed and is being implemented or not, and ex post, what happened as a result of that policy intent and how resources were allocated.
Really helpful. Thank you, Sarah.
Just to briefly add on, because I again agree with Angela and Emma's points on this and the importance of EQIAs in driving decision making. But just as Angela mentioned, the OECD's did a report into a gender budgeting pilot that was conducted in Scotland, and it was published last year with the budget papers, and it highlighted the need for increasing the use of information from EQIAs in the budget decision. So it highlighted that gap in the need to use this information to drive the decision-making process. And I think one of the key things there is the need for leadership from elected members in looking for that information, and also the culture change that Angela's talked about how the information can be used to drive the decisions. When we were reviewing last year's local budget decision makings, we were looking at all the different EQIAs, and we were surprised to find that despite several councils reducing spending in areas such as school transport, additional support for learning, and other care-related areas, only one local authority identified sex as an affected characteristic. So there's a real kind of and we've seen it in some Scottish Government papers more recently in terms of the MTFS, a lack of recognition of unpaid care work and the role that has, and the quality analysis process should help to bring that out as well.
Interesting, thank you. Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Pam, please.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for all the information you've provided so far. My question kind of links in very nicely. So last week we heard from former participants of the Whole Family Equality Project the importance of not working in silo. When looking at areas such as employability, as this often comes hand in hand in other areas that we've heard today, such as housing, education, transport and much more, I remember asking the Equalities Minister in February in here about the need to move away from current portfolio-based budget modelling and towards a more performance-orientated approach. The Minister agreed that departments must work together to achieve the best possible outcomes. But today we've heard lack of connections. It doesn't feed into wider budgets. Some areas of human rights understood and some are not understood. Not followed through how resources are allocated, greater connections and clarity needed, and can't follow the money, what is being spent, and much more. So could you expand on these comments in relation to cross-portfolio approach? And also, do you believe that the Scottish Government is doing a good job at taking a cross-portfolio approach in human rights budgeting? So I'll start with Angela.
Okay. I think there's effort, and Emma has touched on this earlier on. There has been a huge amount of work over the last many years on trying to improve the budget process and trying to improve the integration that we're all talking about today. I think what needs to happen is greater demand, in a sense, of that scrutiny for better accountability from Parliament to the Scottish Government, so to drive for scrutiny to drive better practice, because accountability, there is an accountability gap there that myself and colleagues have referred to today. Moving from portfolio to performance budgeting requires all the actions that we're talking about, to have clearly identified objectives that are based on analysis of the relevant and accurate data, which reflects people's lived experience and the lived realities of people's lives and the extent to which rights are being realised or not. And to make policy then on that basis, and for the outcomes to be measured. And there are examples from around the world and from close by. You look at how the Irish Government has been trying to move to performance budgeting, but again we see some of the same issues there as well in terms of that cross-portfolio thinking, that interrelation between different policy drivers, and I think that's really at the crux of things here. And as the Secretariat of EBAG and the work of EBAG moves from the Equalities and Human Rights Directorate into the Exchequer, there needs to be that overview and that practice of making the connections across portfolios, across spending areas, but in a way that equality and human rights are seen as integral to that process and not of secondary priority or secondary order practice in terms of the approach to analysis and decision making.
Just before I move on, Angela, obviously you said that in the beginning that progress has been made. We are here today obviously highlighting quite a lot of issues, and we spoke about it last week in our private session as well. There is clearly, the system is broken somewhere. There's cracks in the system that the government need to look at, hence why we're scrutinising this today. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. So could I just press on that when you say progress has been made, but yet today we've heard so many issues with connections and accountability. Absolutely, it goes back to the government and making sure that, that leadership is there and stems right down to the councils, and we have heard that as well. So where do you think the progress has been made with government that we think, and where do you kind of think that we're going, what's happening wrong here, and why are we scrutinising this if the government has made progress?
I've said progress has been made, and there's been a lot of work has gone on to try and improve that progress. What I've also pointed to are many of the cracks. I think that's a fair assessment. There are a lot of cracks in this process, and I think the equality and human rights analysis can fall between those cracks. I think the cracks exist, or the cracks that exist are about, as I've said already, lack of knowledge and lack of practice in terms of how tools are used. And I think we've seen I mean, what I was referring to was the significant efforts that have been made by officials that Emma has also alluded to. But we have seen officials rolling boulders up hills and those boulders rolling back down, because there needs to be a whole government approach to this, because what we're talking about here is a whole systems approach. There's a lot of talk about mainstreaming. There's been a lot of talk about mainstreaming equality and human rights for the last 25 years. The government is still consulting on or pondering on a new, yet again, a new mainstreaming strategy. One of the things I've always said around equalities and human rights budgeting is that it activates mainstreaming, because it brings together the whole policy process by bringing together decisions on resource allocation, but as Alan has said, resource revenue raising, policy objectives and resource allocation have to be viewed in the round, and they have to be viewed from a human rights-based approach. And that's the biggest crack, is that latter part is seen as the secondary, not the primary activity.
Thank you, Angela, for clarifying that.
Just one area where we have seen a little bit of progress on trying to do the sort of cross-government cabinet level. I'm sure the Minister and CABSEC will mention this later, is that they now hold a ministerial workshop, I'm not quite sure what the term is, as part of the budget process to try and look across the different core decisions that are being made as part of the budget. And that is led by the Minister for Equalities, as far as I'm aware. It's an internal process, so we are not privy as Airbag to know, exactly what is discussed there, nor what actions follow, what changes that workshop has made. But that's one example of where there has been efforts and progress made towards this cross-government collaboration. But what you said earlier about the portfolio-based approach to budgeting being a constraint here remains very true. And this ministerial workshop is another effort to try and break down some of those silos, or at least to discuss these issues more broadly across the portfolios. But one thing I would flag is that this was part of the public service reform strategy earlier this year, the recognition that moving resources between portfolios is extremely difficult. And that was more focused on the work of the Scottish Government on prevention, which is very aligned to what we're talking about in equality and human rights. But they admit as a government that those processes to allow sharing of budgets or reallocation of budgets, or even a process to ensure that it's not just one minister signing off the budget for its portfolio. I think we do need to see some mechanisms, some changes put in place to the operation of budgets, which we're, given the public service reform strategy, will be looking for in the budget and spending review this year, to put into practice some of the things that they have admitted are cracks themselves.
Yeah, so I think we'll be talking about some of the actions for the government to take a sort of non-siloed approach, but actually I think there's something about Parliament as well. So I think it's very welcome that this committee has been taking that human rights budgeting approach across a number of years. I think probably we're a bit nerdy to say we've all enjoyed it, but it's a really good approach. But what about other committees? So I'll spare the members blushes, but we wrote to several committees after the election 2021, and I remember one member of one committee coming back to say that, well, all this human rights budgeting was an interesting concept, but not really sure it's worth the time or effort. Now, I will say that obviously was 2021 or 2022. Hopefully that member's view has changed since then. It wasn't a member of this committee. But that does sort of suggest, like, if we're effectively treating human rights as effectively the sole purview of this committee, since it has human rights in its name, that's going to lead to that kind of siloing. So it's really important, and we've made this point, I think, in several other occasions, for example, Parliament's approach to commissioners and scrutinising the work of commissioners. If we just pass that to this committee, you're not getting sort of human rights embedded across the whole Parliament. So there's a role here for Parliament too, for all committees to take the kind of approach that this committee has done. I suppose there's also just like touching on some of the points made earlier, because I suppose they're relevant. I had a point about sort of I suppose the directionality of those equality impact assessments of the Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement. So we've got positive narratives. There's a useful tool there for seeing how policies are justified, but there is that question of the directionality. You know, are there equality outcomes which are driving the budget, and this is explaining what those are, or are these effectively is the budget being set anyway, and then as we've sort of discussed, are these add-ons and effectively sort of post hoc rationalisation? Well, here's a policy that was in the budget anyway, and we've found an excuse for why this is a good thing for equality. So there's something there, but as we were sort of touching on earlier, these things need to come earlier in the process. They need to be the starting point and not that kind of like end point of, okay, we've decided to do this policy. What are its impacts?
So going to the next question, is that okay?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. Leading on from Alan, what you've just said, I'll take it as a positive that this committee has been doing good work. Last week's session was very interactive and very productive. I certainly found that, and I'm sure colleagues spoke about it as well. We really enjoyed listening to people with real life experiences as well as to those on the ground. And, and I think this is something that all committees should definitely go out and hear the real life experiences, because sometimes we can be sitting in this building and making laws, making policies, and the fact that, yes, of course there's consultation, but it's so important, and that really showed last week how important it was. An area that was highlighted, and it's been spoke about a lot today, is accountability. Many times it's been spoken about today, and one of the areas on accountability that was spoken about was that sometimes, basically, money is given out from governments here, the Scottish Government here, and into programmes, and people are leading those programmes that maybe may not be so qualified and not with that experience, given large sums of money, and there's no accountability and transparency. But also, I've listened today and I've heard lack of transparency, very difficult again to follow the money, how money is allocated and spent. There is a process failure, lack of process and accountability. Who is accountable to see if progress is made over time? And, where is the money being used from government to council? So I've just given a scenario there that they told us about last week, that they felt the money is given out, but when it goes down the chain, those project managers, that are put into place don't have the experience, they feel, that was said last week, and they're given very large sums of money to run these programmes. And, Alan, you did mention from government to council that accountability, where it is. So it'd be good to hear from yourself to see that, how can accountability improve in programmes, and what more can this committee also do as well, even though we've heard the good work we're doing, but is there more that we could do as well? And now with ministers, obviously, Minister coming later on, that could we ask them the right questions? What would you want us to ask them about when it comes to accountability from top right down to the bottom, so making sure that golden thread is there?
Yeah, so I think there's a good point there about accountability. One of the points that I sort of wanted to make is that often we're working in sort of a political arena. Obviously, the accountability can often be, well, there's an election in a few years' time, and if you do or don't like what the government's done, you can vote for them at that point. And that's not any good if you've got a budget for 2022, 2023, and people have real concerns about a particular area. So, yeah, building in sort of moments for accountability in sort of in-year and sort of in direct response to budgets is definitely important. I think I actually had a question as well that was almost a question for the committee about sort of, well, what was the sort of progress with your own approach of engaging with lived experience. So I'm actually very pleased to hear that that is a thing that has continued, and certainly I would agree with the point about if that's something that other committees can do, to hear about, well, how have, if you take just the Education Committee as an example, how have, children and young people, how have students been affected by particular policies. I think that would be a good approach. Indeed, that's something that the Alliance are very strong on. Like we, for many years, is this idea of hearing from lived experience and making sure that when you're hearing from them, that experience is properly valued, and it's not people just being made to repeat their story over and over again, but again, it's actually informing decisions on an equal basis. So there's opportunities, I think, certainly for all levels of government to do more, for example, lived experience panels, to get those people to come in to talk about the experience. And as you're saying, I think you often end up with people who are perfectly qualified to handle money in the sense of being, that is their job, that is their profession, but not necessarily understanding the impacts on people, and even just making the space for those sort of officials, as it were, to hear from the people directly impacted, I think can improve their understanding of how equalities are being delivered on the ground. So certainly I think that's something that should be taken forward more broadly, is getting more of that sort of lived experience from all kinds of groups and formalising that and giving them more of a sort of an institutional role.
Thank you.
I'll just briefly talk about the really important role of proper impact evaluation here, particularly when money goes out with government, to local government, to the third sector, to the private sector. That money does need to go with an expectation that there will be a good impact evaluation done. And that does require resource, and that is often the first thing that gets cut out of budgets for particularly budgets going to the third sector. And I think there does need to be a more understanding and better capacity within organisations that receive public money to allow them to know how to do a good, robust evaluation. But in terms of how that relates back to accountability, I mean, who is accountable for ensuring that public money is being spent and delivering what it's expected to deliver? And I don't really know the answer to that question. So I think that would be an interesting one to put to the government. So when large sums of money are leaving the government to deliver an outcome that the government has set, who is accountable for ensuring that the sufficient evaluation is done, and the answers to that question are available for evidence for scrutiny by committees like this?
I was certainly putting that to the government, yeah. Is there anything else?
Angela would like to come in.
Just very quickly, who is accountable? I mean, ultimately, well, one answer is that ultimately the Scottish Parliament is the ultimate guarantor of human rights in Scotland. And so the scrutiny exercised by all committees, as Alan has said, and in Chamber is essential, and that requires, the Scottish Parliament committees to scrutinise duty bearers, and the frameworks have been set out there, whether that's the AAAQ framework or those frameworks that exist in the international treaties that clearly set out what the obligations are. We've been in front of this committee and others around the concluding observations of, for example, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, again saying these are the gaps that have been found, these are the actions that are required to address them, and that's for Parliament to again hold government and duty bearers to account. And I think going back to your point about how well equipped are those to whom public money is discharged, I think there clearly is a need for better knowledge and understanding of human rights obligations in terms of policy, of service design and, as Emma has said, evaluation. But that also requires a knowledge and understanding of human rights obligations to hold those duty bearers to account. And so that's, and also requires, I think, clear direction from government or within duty bearer relationships, because there's a complex arrangement of delivery partners, whether that's in health and social care or in detention or across public sector. And to come back to your earlier point, Pam, about cracks, those cracks arise if the scrutiny isn't consistent across all of those, and if there isn't a consistency in understanding of what the objectives, what the purpose is of the delivery. And so I think that ultimately comes back to Parliament in terms of its scrutiny of duty bearers, and participation of lived experiences is key to that. And having long been an advocate of that to this committee and elsewhere, it's really welcome to see the progress that there is on participation, but also worth noting how under-resourced that is in terms of the Parliament being able to support effective participation, and that's something else to consider.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's a really, really interesting session we've had. Unfortunately, my question's been covered, what I was going to ask. So,
is that...
Put it back for time.
Okay. Thank you very much. That brings our first panel to a conclusion, and I want to thank everybody for your participation this morning. We will now suspend briefly for a changeover of witnesses for our next panel. Thank you. started. I would now like to welcome our second panel of witnesses today. Shona Robson, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government. Cocab Stewart, MSP, Minister for Equalities. Rob Priestley, Head of Mainstreaming Unit, Scottish Government. Alistair Black, Deputy Director, Budget and Fiscal Coordination, Scottish Government. I would now like to invite the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary to make short opening statements. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks for the opportunity to set out the work that we're doing to strengthen accountability and ensure that equalities and human rights principles remain at the heart of the budget and the spending review process. The Scottish Government places the utmost importance in being open and transparent about how, where and why decisions are taken on public finances. And I want to take just a moment to reflect on what's been achieved. So, given the focus of this session, I'm very heartened that the SHRC's report last year on how the Scottish budget for 2021-22 stacked up against international best practice showed that Scotland would be the highest scoring country for budget oversight in the 2023 Open Budget Survey Global Rankings. The most recent results for Scotland represent good progress since the last time that the SHRC ran this assessment in 2019, when they were assessing the 2017-18 Scottish budget, with scores up across the board on participation, transparency and oversight. Indeed, when compared against the latest OBS Global Report 2023, country rankings, all three of Scotland's scores sit higher than the respective global averages. In comparison, globally, Scotland is one of only a small number of comparison countries where progress has been made, rather than stagnating or slipping backwards. Of course, as ever, more needs to be done, and we remain committed to making further improvements and responding to feedback. For example, committees asked us to move towards multi-year budgeting to demonstrate accountability. And as a result, this year we're undertaking a spending review alongside the Scottish budget for 26-27. And this will set spending envelopes for 3 future years for resource and 4 for capital. To support these processes, we're continuing to conduct impact assessments and make decisions informed by high quality evidence, ensuring that we focus on the impact on protected groups and are compliant with our statutory duties. We're operating in, of course, a challenging fiscal environment, and it's critical that we focus our resources to deliver value for money and to advance equality. We're also introducing a new strategic integrated impact assessment approach this year, aimed at integrating multiple statutory duties to provide a more rounded and holistic understanding of the potential impact. So our goal is to enhance both the efficiency and the effectiveness of these assessments. This work is being shaped in collaboration with stakeholders, including the Equalities and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group and the OECD. And with that, I'm grateful for the committee's time today, and I'll hand over to the Minister for Equalities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for your introduction, and thank you for the committee. I welcome the opportunity to appear jointly, demonstrating our shared commitment to collaboration and advancing equality, inclusion and human rights across all of government. Our shared ambition is to ensure equality and human rights are central to budget decisions. We continue to build on our partnership, meeting regularly to maintain a consistent and embedded focus on equality in budgeting, as well as taking the advice directly from the Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group. As I've said previously, my personal visible leadership is critical to this. I've been actively engaging with colleagues across portfolios, supporting and challenging them to identify meaningful actions to address inequality in Scotland. To date, I've held over 14 meetings with ministerial colleagues, focused on identifying practical steps each portfolio can take to improve equality and human rights outcomes. For example, earlier this year, I worked in collaboration with the Cabinet Secretary for Transport to launch a pilot scheme that will provide free rail travel for companions of blind and partially sighted people. These conversations have been constructive and forward-looking, and I've been encouraged by the shared commitment across government. We all have a responsibility to tackle inequality and uphold human rights, and I'm determined that this is reflected in our actions. One example of this is the pre-budget ministerial equality workshop. This was first held in 2023, and since then we have scheduled this earlier in the budget process, and I've taken a more substantive role within the workshop. This workshop enables ministers to discuss the impacts of potential budget allocations on equality groups before these decisions are taken. It's a powerful tool for embedding these principles into our policy and budgetary thinking. And of course, the budget doesn't exist in isolation. The quality of analysis for the budget depends on how well equality and human rights are mainstreamed across government. That is why, when we published our long-term equality outcomes this year, we focused on outcomes that enact as enablers of system-wide change, improving the use and awareness of equality evidence, improving how we are informed by lived experience and participation, and strengthening relevant impact assessments. To support this, each outcome is backed by both short and long-term actions over a 4-year period. We will be regularly reporting on these actions, further increasing transparency and accountability. And these improvements directly support the work that Ms Robertson and her team deliver through the budget. We hope that the committee recognises the government's continued dedication to advancing equality and human rights budgeting and the tangible actions that we are taking to drive improvement. And of course, there remains more to do, and we will continue to listen, to engage with and to act on feedback from this committee and other stakeholders. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you both very much. We're now going to move on to questions from members. And I'm going to start us off. I'm going to ask the Cabinet Secretary, is the Scottish Government still committed to human rights budgeting? And if so, what does that look like?
So, absolutely we are. And I think we have heard from the Minister for Equalities about the changes that we've made in the process to ensure that it's not an analysis after the event, but actually an engagement before budgetary decisions are made to ensure that the decisions and the potential decisions are put through the lens of a human rights perspective. So I think what success looks like is having that engagement earlier to make sure that it is then transparent and open in terms of what that assessment looks like. And I think the added opportunity on this occasion with the fiscal events that are coming up are that through the spending review, we're able to demonstrate that line of sight of funding that will ensure that we can be open and transparent about the commitment over a number of years to this work. And it's not just the Minister for Equality's job to ensure that human rights are at the heart of the budget process, but it's every Cabinet Secretary and Minister's job to ensure that they have that at the centre of the work they're doing, but also that they engage with the Minister for Equalities, who is, I guess, maybe providing a bit of a check in the system that the processes that are underway and the work that is underway is meeting the requirements. It's been done in a way that is engaging not just with ministerial colleagues, but obviously some key stakeholder groups as well. So I think that's what it looks like. It shouldn't be overly complicated, but it should have a demonstrable effect. And we're not just talking about funding within the Equalities brief. Just to emphasise that point, we're talking about funding across the board and looking at whether or not the decisions that we're making and the decisions that have been made can stand up to the scrutiny of a human rights perspective. So that's, but we're not there yet. You know, we've got work to do, but I think progress has been made, as I outlined in my opening statement.
Okay, thank you. Minister, you spoke there about the Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group, and I'm wondering, could you outline some of the progress that's been made against the group's recommendations?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'd like to thank the Airbag members for their valuable support and their input. And, of course, I'd like to take the opportunity to extend a special thanks to Emma Congreve for her thoughtful leadership as the interim chair. I think I recall that we wrote to the committee on the 19th of February, I think, to update you on the Scottish Government's progress against the recommendations that were made by the group. And at that time, I was confident that we were making good progress on the actions and are broadly on track to meet those within the proposed timeframes. Back then, 22 actions, 9 had been completed and 12 were in progress, and 1 was yet underway because it was contingent on the completion of another action. So some of the completed actions, they include agreeing in partnership with Airbag the continued improvements to the EFSBS, taking a more integrated approach to the equality analysis of the programme for government and budget. We've also been establishing a senior leadership group to scrutinise and bring challenge to our approach to embed equality and human rights and enable that cultural change, and of course publication of an easy read version. So since February there's been further progress to support our commitment in Scotland to equality-led budgeting. The Scottish Government is hosting its first international knowledge exchange event in October. This will bring together experts from across government and civic society to explore how integrated impact assessments can advance equality and human rights in budgeting, and that should be fostering a more collaborative approach, embedding inclusive and evidence-based practices into future budget processes. I know on June the 11th, for instance, the Airbag meeting, members agreed that reporting on the action plan will pause while further consideration is given to the group's terms of reference. But during this time, work continues. So our focus will shift into the 2 strategic objectives for this year, which are achieving an integrated budget impact assessment and, of course, proposals to improve budget transparency and accessibility.
Thank you. In terms of the Equality Data Improvement Programme, has the work on this, has this been improving outcomes, and where are we at with that?
So improvements are being made to the availability and analysis of equality data across the Scottish Government through the Equality Data Improvement Programme and the Equality Evidence Strategy, which is from 23 to 25. And that includes the improvements to the collection and analysis of disaggregated and intersectional data across policy areas. Now, good progress has been seen across the strategy as of July 2025. Out of the 45 actions in the strategy, 17 are complete. 20 are in progress, and officials are supporting the remainder of the actions where possible to be delivered within the strategy period. An evaluation of the current equality evidence strategy to examine the impacts, including how this work has improved the outcomes, will commence sort of very shortly, and work is underway to begin the development of the next equality evidence strategy, and that will be done in collaboration with analysts, policymakers, external organisations that are interested in improving equality evidence.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Good morning to both the Cabinet Secretary and Minister. Thank you for joining us this morning. My questions follow on from Karen's questions, really around understanding progress, or maybe where there hasn't been progress, how the government is approaching those. And one area that's come up in our discussions with stakeholders earlier this morning and previously has been around the link between the positive narrative and vision that we have in social care, but the lack of delivery in outcome, that implementation gap. And the very specific example that we heard from the Alliance this morning was, the legislation that was initially proposed to really transform social care, to embed human rights in every element of social care provision, became a scrap about territory and powers between government and between the Scottish Government and COSLA. And I just wondered how the Scottish Government is working on navigating those kinds of issues where we have other tensions, other structural tensions that come in that actually impede the delivery of what is a very powerful and admirable narrative around that drive for the delivery of human rights and equality for all in Scotland. I don't know, Cabinet Secretary, if you want to start that, and then I'll go to the Minister.
Well, I mean, I think you touch on a real tension. I'm going to have to watch I don't go back to being a home care organiser, which is what I was in my former years. I feel very passionate about this area, and without a doubt there are huge improvements that need to be made. Now, clearly the National Care Service, as you have pointed out, became, well, what you've described as focused around territory and powers and on disagreement rather than the areas that there was very much extensive broad agreement on. And I think, for me, at the heart, maybe what was lost was at the heart of it should have been, what do service users and their carers want to see from social care services. And I think that got lost somewhat in that debate and got lost in here as well. So I think there is an opportunity with the where we have got to really work outside of the silos of Scottish Government or local government to focus on how are we going to improve social care, not just in the here and now, but when you look at the demographics, the huge increase in the over 80s that is coming not in the not too distant future, the requirement for us to really take a root and branch look at how we provide social care and make sure that the budgets work as well, because again, silos don't help in this territory, and the health and social care integrated boards were established with the intent of moving away from siloed budgets, but there is still, in my opinion, far too much siloed working going on, and we all have to, I think, take a step back and think about how are we going to transform social care in a way that is going to meet the needs, not just in the current time, but into the future. And human rights are at the heart of that, because the rights of those who are often the most vulnerable in our society need to be first and foremost. And if we keep that at the heart of our discussions, then perhaps we can avoid falling back into what you described as a sort of territory and powers issue. So I could talk all day about this, so I'm going to stop myself, because it is an area that I think we need to have a very long, hard look at.
No, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And yeah, I mean, I think any one area, policy area, we could probably spend all day talking about the gap between our narrative and vision and delivery and outcomes. I suppose one of the challenges, again, put to us this morning was not always being able to connect up or understand that actually across the board when we are making assessments, human rights assessments on budgetary decisions, there isn't always the same level of quality assurance across the board. There isn't always the same understanding of where the degrees of tolerance are. There isn't always the same kind of understanding of some of the need for assessment of outcomes. And again, a social care example, that the Scottish Government commitment to raise funding by 20%, good, well recognised, well acknowledged and welcomed commitment, but not really always the assessment of how that funding was being used, how it was actually delivering positive outcomes and securing the minimum core obligations that we have for people. So I wondered if you could say something more about the government's work on trying to make sure that actually in every directorate across all levels of government, right from the top all the way down, there's that shared understanding of having to draw the thread together from narrative to outcome delivery.
Yeah. I'll come in on that one. I think on my previous sort of appearances in front of the committee, I have emphasised my personal commitment to provide that support and challenge across portfolios. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think it's 14 ministerial meetings that I have had now. We are working differently, and by the very nature of how governments are set up, there are departments, everybody has their subject areas, even political in the chamber we have shadow ministers and, they cover portfolios. So it's also about cultural change, and I've said that, is that there has to be that will to change, and we need to take people with us in order to do that by demonstrating the positive effects that it can have. So that's part of my support and challenge, is that if we are undertaking the impact assessments earlier, it leads to better decision making in the future, especially in these times of fiscal challenge when financial decisions are very serious decisions. Money is not finite. So to make sure, as the Cabinet Secretary says, that we are looking after the most vulnerable people, but also seeing the intersections of a decision in one portfolio area and the effect that that can have in another portfolio area. And I am satisfied that whilst there is much more to do, and that's why having a vision and having that bold ambition is important, because it gives us that clear trajectory to aspire to that. But the journey is long and it's complicated. But I can assure the committee that we're making good progress along that way.
Okay, thanks, Minister. I suppose one of the other things we heard this morning was around the tools that are available to you, to your colleagues, to throughout government, at different levels of government too, in thinking about local government as well. But national outcomes are one of those key tools. We've got national outcomes, we've got the national performance framework, but these don't always match up, or there isn't always, you can't always follow the thread through from national, from NPF, from budgets, from programme for government to the delivery of outcomes. And I wondered if either Minister or Cab Sec could say a little bit more about how you are trying to follow those things through a little bit more concretely, and I suppose tagged onto that, given what's your assessment of the delay of refreshing some of the national outcomes?
So I think it's a fair challenge, but one of the reasons it is being overhauled is we want it to work better. So the point and challenge you're making is one of the reasons that we want to have a refreshed set of national outcomes, and a lot of work has gone on around gathering evidence from experts, public consultation, and getting that right has meant a delay, but I think getting it right is the most important thing. And Deputy First Minister has been very clear that the National Performance Framework remains a very important vision, and it can create that thread, and there are regular holding to account sessions with senior civil servants and cabinet secretaries and ministers around the delivery of the National Performance Framework and where we are on the outcome. So it is an important high level mechanism to hold ourselves and others to account. So getting it right is very, very important. So I think you're right to challenge, but I think that's exactly why the substantial overhaul of the NPF is being undertaken. It has to, that thread and consistency and linkage to the missions and the priorities has to absolutely be there. So hopefully when that is concluded, hopefully the committee will see the benefit of that.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Karen, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have questions from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary and Minister. My question is around the Human Rights Bill has been flagged as essential to helping citizens understand minimum core requirements. And the question here is, how is the Scottish Government working to progress the public's understanding of human rights, given the decision not to legislate this session?
Thank you. Thanks. I'll deal with the minimum core. I actually recall when I was convener that I was asking questions of government representatives regarding the minimum core. So I do take a special interest in that bit in particular. Now, we do understand that the minimum core, as the most fundamental requirements of social, economic and cultural rights that every state must uphold at all times, irrespective of resources, such as the right to adequate food, housing and healthcare. I know that the Scottish Human Rights Commission promotes these concepts within the context of a potential human rights bill, which aims to incorporate certain international treaties into domestic law to ensure that everyone in Scotland can access these essential rights. So we can understand that minimum core obligations, they fall into two categories. For the budget process, which includes running the process differently, driven by principles of transparency, participation, accountability, which I know that those are the themes that the committee have been considering. And the second category is for the actual budget itself. And that includes demonstrating that the actual content of a budget, for instance, the decisions taken around how money is raised, allocated and spent, should be in line with human rights obligations. And that covers particularly the maximum available resources. So governments are obliged to take steps to progressively realise the rights to the maximum of its available resources, and also progressive realisation. So governments must take steps towards the full realisation of the rights that I mentioned. And the minimum core obligations, of course, they're understood as being the minimum protections that governments should guarantee to everyone. Well, we know that the human rights paper, it was published in July, the discussion paper, and it sets out the potential proposals for ministers to run a participatory process to help inform that minimum standard of social, economic and cultural rights. And one of the actions that was identified in that paper was to further develop the thinking on minimum standards and what that participatory process might look like. And it might be worth just noting that we don't have globally, internationally, we don't have an agreement of what minimum core obligations actually are, because they will differ for every nation, depending on what I said earlier about the maximum resources that are available. So it's new territory, but I can assure you that it has been taken incredibly seriously. So I think, I hope that covers that bit of it. I think regarding not to legislate, so quite rightly, Tess White sort of like, well, what are we doing in between time? And as I said, we've published the discussion paper. So the capability building programme that we are taking forward to help the public sector and the wider duty bearers for the Human Rights Bill. And in this financial year, we have invested up to about £200,000 to increase that knowledge and understanding of the rights that are proposed for incorporation across local authorities, health and social care providers. We're also engaging with we will be engaging with organisations funding through the Equality and Human Rights Fund to facilitate a knowledge exchange on the rights proposed, and they're preparing the ground for future duties. Our capability building workshop group is helping to inform the delivery of this work in 25 to 26 and of course beyond. So making that information accessible and available on human rights, it's vital to allow the rights holders to claim them, and working with stakeholders, we'll develop plans for information, awareness raising, including a campaign that's aligned with the future timescales of the implementation of future human rights. There is, of course, the mainstreaming, we're developing a toolkit as part of the mainstreaming strategy, and that will assist with improving competence in that area. That will be an online platform, and that will have training, continual professional development, sort of checklists, best practice, so lots and lots of practical support, and of course examples to support Scottish Government directorates as well, and the wider Scottish public sector, so people can evaluate the mainstreaming strategies and human rights priorities and take actions where that's appropriate.
Thank you, Minister. This session is on about accountability. And take, for example, use the word should be, obliged, must, minimum protections, yet the Scottish Human Rights Commission has been operating for 17 years without any legal enforcement powers, and its remit is still based on the 2006 Act that created it. So very recently, the SNP ministers, including yourself, have shelved the Human Rights Bill, which could have at least given the SHRC some teeth, and teeth that it needs, because you can't enforce. So my question, Minister, is how can you and the SNP government claim it's committed to human rights when it hasn't delivered the legislation to improve scrutiny of its human rights record?
I have some sympathy with your line of questioning on that. However, I think in my previous answer, I've given a very clear indication of the extensive work that we are undertaking. And it's not a shelving, it is a delay in order to be able to advance that work and to get it right. There are many, many treaties that are being incorporated. This is a hefty piece of work to get all these different things to align. There are, in fact, treaties that have not been adopted by other countries. So some of this work is groundbreaking in that sense. And that requires time to take everybody with us to make sure that duty bearers know what they are doing and how they are doing their work and what implications for future legislative change in many different portfolio areas, and also for the rights holders to be able to uptake their rights as well. So it is absolutely not a shelving. It is a reasonable delay in order to make sure that that work can be undertaken in full consultation with all the civic organisations, including stakeholders, and the SHRC are very valued partners in that. With regards to their enforcement powers and they do an amazing amount of work. There's snapshots where they really sort of hone in on particular areas. Those are really valuable spotlights. Thank you for that. That they do, and I do have absolute sympathy for that, and that will come out as the bill advances. So that's not off the table. Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. We now move on to questions from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, Minister, and to your team as well. Minister, on the 25th of February, you said in response to one of my questions, my role is not to make ministers' decisions for them, but to highlight those of intersectionalities, to get them talking to one another, and more important, to get them to do that prior to making any decisions. That is a change of approach. I assure the committee that I am robustly challenging my colleagues to consider those things, to come out of our silos and to move towards the outcome rather than outcomes that are based on portfolios. Could I ask, has there been any progress on this? And are ministers actually talking to one another to achieve the best possible outcome? Because, as we know, women are often faced with disadvantages when it comes to employment, which are often made worse by an unequal burden of family responsibilities. So how are ministers working together to ensure that women are not placed at a disadvantage, especially when it comes to employment? I also want to highlight, Minister and Cabinet Secretary, some of the evidence we took earlier on, some of the comments made. Lack of connections, it doesn't feed into the wider budget. Some areas of human rights are understood and some are not. Not followed through how resources are allocated. Greater connections and clarity needed. Can't follow the money, what is being spent. These are clearly issues, and there's cracks showing in the system that the Scottish Government cannot ignore. And it's good we have you here today to provide us that evidence on, one, I've asked the question on what you've been doing from the 25th of February. Two, what is the work you're doing on women being at a disadvantage, especially around employment? And last but not least, maybe the Cabinet Secretary would like to answer. The last one is, what would you say about the comments that are made today, especially in all the connectivity? And I know, Cabinet Secretary, you did mention that the fact is there is still silo work happening and there's still more work to be done. So it would be good to hear from you in relation to what your response is to the comments we heard earlier on. So over to you, Minister, first.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, it's always strange when your words are quoted back to you, and I stand by them. I think in my opening statement, I gave an outline of the work that I have been doing. That kind of infrastructural work when you're doing cultural change and enabling conversations, increasing knowledge, competence, all of that kind of stuff, capability. It doesn't grab the headlines, but what it does do is that the foundations that are there in order for the future decisions to be made are more robust, they are more connected, as you say, which all feeds into some of the remarks that you were were saying that came out from the session this morning. So none of that, in that sense, surprises me. And thanks for the opportunity for, again, reinforcing what the role of an Equalities Minister is. The demand, the right demand for mainstreaming, and that is a demand that I take very seriously. So with my sort of support and challenge to colleagues, and I can say that yes, they are speaking to each other. They always have done. I think sometimes what gets lost, with the best will in the world, because we referred to it earlier, is that everybody has their different portfolios. People are very keen on getting on with their job. So to have somebody that can take a wider view and to see all the connections and then to offer that. It's been very well received by my colleagues, and I think one massive demonstration is the fact that the Cabinet Secretary and I are both here during a pre-budget scrutiny session together. So that is another indication of how we are coming out of our silos. I always say that everybody wants everyone else to come out of their silos until I turn around and say you come out of yours, and that's always a bit more challenging. So there's also the annual ministerial budget workshop, and that sort of is actually a great opportunity where everybody is in the room at the same time, and it means that clear connections can be made between portfolio decisions in the room in live time, and I'm able to add my voice to that as well. And the focus on protected characteristics, socio-economic disadvantage, children's rights, for instance, embed equality and human rights into decision as that they make. The new equality outcomes were published in April this year, and we've taken a new approach to the equality outcome setting process, so that it does provide that consistency that Pam Gosal was asking for, and that leadership across government. So the focus on 3 key outcomes that act as enablers of that system-wide change, which is, I think, what we're all wanting, they're focused on improving the use and awareness of equality evidence, improving how we are informed by lived experience and participation, and strengthening the relevant impact assessments. So each outcome is also underpinned by short-term and long-term actions over a 4-year period. And that focus on system change, I hope that gives a clear indication of our commitment to drive that meaningful, long-term change by addressing, I suppose, the structural barriers that, well, they impact equality across all of Scottish Government. We're very much aware of that. I hope that's enough information. I'm quite happy
Minister, I just want to touch before I go on to the Cabinet Secretary. It's good to hear the 3 outcomes. When we talk about policy and strategies and outcomes, they're great words in a document, but my question in relation to what are you actually doing on the ground to ensure that women are not placed at disadvantage, especially when it comes to employment? What's actually happening on the ground out there? How are we helping those women get into employment, whether it be around care, housing? And it won't be in silo, it'll be a number of departments that will have to work with you on that. But it'll be really good, because I'm sure those women out there are listening, that they want to hear what is the Scottish Government doing about helping those women back into work, or staying in work even.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also need to bear in mind that, due to circumstances, some women may not be able to work. So it's important that they get access to the benefits that they are entitled to as well. So I'm aware of the intersectionalities around women and girls. So practically, I can't speak on behalf of other portfolios, but I can give you an indication of what in my particular portfolio. Now, in order for women and girls to be able to be empowered to exercise, their equal opportunities, the right to work, for instance, but also the disadvantages and the detriments that they face. They need to be able to have equitable access to economic resources, decision making, live their lives sort of like free from violence, abuse, harassment. So in 2025-26, we are providing over £2 million to 10 gender equality organisations, including 1.8 million through the Equality and Human Rights Fund. And that makes up, so the money that we're putting, from my portfolio area, that we're putting into women and girls makes up 22% of the Equality and Human Rights Fund, and that £2 million and the 1.8, that's in addition to the 21 million that's provided to organisations via the Delivering Equally Safe Fund on preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls. I hope that gives some example.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Okay. Well, look, first of all, let me say that there's always more work to be done, so we have to acknowledge that. And the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls are very challenging in this space. So they've challenged the First Minister, they've challenged all of us to do more. And the work with them, of course, led to the funded work with the OECD to explore how gender budgeting approaches can be applied to the budget process to be better and be able to evidence that we are going deeper and further around gender budgeting across the whole of the investments that we make. And through that pilot, I think we were able to identify where some of the gaps were. So, for example, one was they need to have a more strategic, overarching gender goal, and they need to move away from portfolio-based budget models into a more out of the silos, I think you described, which is going to be part of a need for a longer-term reform programme. We're getting better at it. So if we take some examples around the tackling of child poverty, and you look at the Child Poverty Delivery Plan, it is a plan that isn't just about the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice's job, it's everybody's job. And if you look at the inputs into it, whether it's yes, the Scottish Child Payment, but it's also things like the employability programmes, childcare, other services, fair work, living wage, transport, things that sit across government that have to be brought to bear in order to have the biggest impact. I had a meeting last night with local government around how we work together to align again around our child poverty objectives for the next delivery plan. So just to assure you that work is continuing. And on the employability service itself, we recognise that child poverty has a very, very strong gendered element, and particularly if you're in a single parent household, you're more likely to experience poverty. So that means that the support to parents towards and into work has to fit around the person. And some of the most successful programmes, I think, have been delivered by third sector organisations, some of which are quite discreet, but they build up a trust with women, parents, and bridge that gap into statutory services. And I think we need to look at what works, and some of those have been very, very successful. Is the job done? No, far from it. But I think there are some good examples that we can point to of where there's strength, and we need to build on that.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, I wanted to ask a question that earlier on you may be listening, that I said to Emma Congreve that I would ask this question for. It was brought up in the earlier session. Whilst it's good to hear that progress is being made, and you have acknowledged that there are gaps and cracks there that need looking at and addressing, but I think it's shocking in this day and age that the word accountability for any government to have no accountability. And I'm not saying directly they have no accountability, of course they have it, but to hear organisations and witnesses saying questions on that, you know, when large sums of money leave the Scottish Government, this was mentioned earlier on, large sums of money leave the Scottish Government, therefore sufficient evaluation is needed. And early on, Emma said that she doesn't know who is accountable. So when money goes out from the Scottish Government, it goes into local authorities. And from local authorities, it may then go into private sector or other charitable, other organisations. Where does the accountability lie? Where is that leadership and where is that transparency, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, look, accountability is absolutely key, and I'd be happy to have a further discussion with Emma or any other stakeholders who want to talk about this in more depth. And, you know, in my opening remarks, I talked about where Scotland sits in terms of international best practice around being transparent about how, where and why decisions are taken on the public finances. So I think if you compare us on some of those key measurements with other countries, you know, we're work to do, but we're certainly making progress there. You touch on a really important point around where money is routed through. So, of course, if local government were sitting around this table, they would say, well, we're autonomous elected bodies where decisions around funding should be made. And we have quite an ongoing debate in Parliament when I hear people calling for more direction of resources through local government and more ring fencing, and I hear calls for ring fencing to be removed entirely and for our 32 local authorities to be entirely free to spend the money as they so wish. And that's a difficult tension. And I think where we've tried to get to through the Verity House Agreement, for example, is to have explicit shared objectives that the public can see, that they can hold all organisations to account for in terms of tackling child poverty, growing the economy, public services and tackling climate change, and what are we going to do and how does the money align to those objectives. But it is a tension and I don't think we should pretend otherwise. And, you know, I have colleagues who would say to me, you know, those discrete areas of funding, if we remove the ring fencing of them, how can we guarantee that they'll still be spent on homelessness services or other discrete areas of work? But then I have others, particularly from local government, say you should have no ring fencing. So, you know, we these are tensions, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. But, you know, in amongst all of that, we have to clearly demonstrate that the key missions that the First Minister has set out, that the funding is aligning to those missions, and that again is work in progress. But, you know, if you take child poverty, for example, I would contend that the reason that we're seeing child poverty levels falling, not fast enough and far enough, but they are falling, is because we have been able to align resources both with from Scottish Government and local government, third sector, to that very, very clear key mission that everybody understands. So, you know, that is my honest assessment of where I think we're at. It is a tension, but we need to work through it because every pound that is spent is public money, wherever it's routed through, and it needs to be spent in the most efficient and effective manner with very clear objectives.
Thank you for that response, Cabinet Secretary. Just to go back to that, obviously you have given a lot of information there, and you're absolutely right. Whilst we welcome a lot of powers to be given to local authorities, I think it's important not just for you to speak to Emma direct, but obviously today everybody listening, that from all what you've said, if I had to ask you that question, and sorry to be so direct, but it's important, this is taxpayers' money. And we've heard a lot from basically our workshop last week and this week on different areas where they think the money could be better, more transparent and accountable. If I asked you the question, Cabinet Secretary, who is accountable for when it comes to human rights budgeting and making sure that the money goes down that golden thread, and who is actually accountable? Is it leadership or is it people all the way down?
It's everybody. Everybody is accountable for... So we're accountable, clearly, for setting the budgets and agreeing budgets, and that, in many ways, is a parliamentary role. You know, we can't we can put forward a budget, but at the end of the day, it has to be supported in order for it to become enacted, and for the money to flow in for the priorities that are collectively agreed. And then, once funding is allocated, it is up to local authorities, health boards, third sector to focus on the objectives that are collectively agreed. Now, accountability is at a number of levels. We're all accountable at the end of the day to the electorate, but also our public servants, and particularly our leadership in the public service, are also accountable to be able to demonstrate progress on the objectives, and to be questioned if those objectives are not being met. We should all be open to being scrutinised, and local government as well. I don't think there's anything to be concerned about in terms of being able to, you should be able to address why, for example, there's variation, and some local authorities are making great progress in an area, others not so much. I think the more scrutiny that's applied to why, now it might be that they're doing better in a different area, but we should be open to having that scrutinised and analysed, and I think the more of that, the better. But we will follow up on the points. I wasn't able to watch the session earlier, but I will get a note of the key points, and I'm very happy to engage with people beyond the session.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That was my last question to add there. Would you follow up, please, to see where the comments have come from and why they're there, even though from top to right to the bottom, to see what is happening and where it's happening and where the cracks are appearing. But thank you very much.
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tess White has indicated she has a supplementary, and then Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's a supplementary on the Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement. So my question, if I may, Cabinet Secretary, there is a published analysis by protected characteristic, and the Minister's talked about the importance of looking at data by protected characteristic. And if we're focusing on minimum core, take, for example, breastfeeding. So breastfeeding inequalities relating to the protected characteristic of pregnancy and maternity is highlighted on page 19 of the report. So my question is, if the Scottish Government is serious about tackling breastfeeding inequalities affecting young mothers and those from deprived areas, then why are vital support services in, let's say, for example, NHS Lothian and Greater Glasgow and Clyde being cut?
Well, look, I'll certainly look into that specifically. I mean, it goes back, I think, to Pam Gosel's challenge to some extent, in that we provide health boards with their allocation through the formula that has been used for many years, that is to take account of deprivation, take account of ageing population, and so on and so forth. Now, there are contentions there from around whether that has where that ends up landing in terms of the overall budget. So we have a growing budget for health and social care, and the formula is applied in terms of which each health board then receives. They then have quite a great deal of discretion around how that funding is deployed. Now, they will have, again, running a health board is not an easy task. There are so many pressures of an ageing population, both in terms of planned care, and there's obviously a lot of focus on that, in terms of population health, and one of the issues you've raised is very much in that space. And how does a health board manage its resources, and even though they're increasing, against that landscape of pressures? And what you'll find across the health boards is a bit like local government in some respects. Some health boards will be very good and will have outcomes that are impressive in a whole list of areas, but they might not be doing so well in this area. And the issue you have highlighted, there'll be some health boards that are doing better than others. within that service. So the question is, again, how much do we want to direct health boards around the services that they provide, and how much discretion do they have? And that is a tension, because we want them to do so much, and there are, lots of pressure on them to improve A&E waiting times, to improve planned care, cancer care, and yet we've got these really important population preventative measures, because we know breastfeeding is a really key preventative tool. And that is a tension. And that's the honest answer. Now, they should be held to account, and we do, and the Health Secretary holds them to account for the services that they provide. But there is that variation across the board. I'm keen to minimise variation, I'll be honest. And it is an issue I'll take away on the specific. But I hope I've provided a bit of background to why services sometimes vary from one health board to another.
And thank you, Cabinet Secretary. But you can understand that this morning, in the previous session, there is a huge concern that there's a gap between narrative and practice. And if you take something as clear as breastfeeding against a backdrop of who is accountable, if even the most basic is not being followed through as a defined minimum core, then do you have a concern that there does need to be tighter follow through to make sure there is accountability for those minimum core criteria?
There should be accountability, and I said earlier on, we need to hold our senior leaders in the public sector and whatever organisation to account for the services they provide. The only point I was making is they've got quite a challenging job to do because of all the pressures and demands in an ageing population that are there. I think the population health framework, that has set out a real intention to try and enhance population health measures that can have huge benefits further down the line. And we know, for example, of the investment in early years and family nurse partnerships. All of those upstream investments have great benefits later on. I think breastfeeding is absolutely one of those interventions. So, we absolutely recognise the point that health boards will there will be variation there. It is the question for us is what tolerance of variation are we prepared to tolerate, and where is the accountability? Accountability has to be there, and there has to be a service standard, across the board. And as I say, I will take that issue back to health colleagues.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you. Minister.
Come in on that. Just to add just a couple of short points, just to remind everyone that health boards, along with other public service providers, they have to undertake equality impact assessments on any decisions that they make. So it's just putting that on the record, to look at that and then to take mitigating factors into account. If there is a disproportionate impact on certain groups, for instance, what mitigating actions are they going to take? So put that on. The other thing to note would be that I can confirm the responsibility for the airbag secretariat function that has now been transferred officially over to the Scottish Exchequer, which I know was a request over a period of time. So I hope again that gives clear evidence that alignment of I think a member said follow the money kind of thing. So that kind of it's now shifted portfolio into the Scottish Exchequer. So there is your direct link that's been demonstrated there. Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. And now move on to questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener. And on the point of accountability made by Pam Gosling earlier on, I can communicate on behalf of local government, being a former councillor, and I remember being under rigorous scrutiny, continuously providing feedback and evaluations and meeting KPI targets as well, and demonstrating that we actually had met those outcomes. So there's a lot of pressure on local governments and obviously health boards as well. So But back onto the question I was going to ask, obviously, our user engagement work over this session has shown us the importance of involving citizens in budgeting and having that opportunity to explore budget scrutiny a bit more. I'm interested to hear what has been achieved by the Scottish Government on its own work on the citizen involvement in the budget.
Well, I'm happy to kick that off again. First of all, just agree with you on the point you made about local government and health boards. You know, there is scrutiny there, and it's a difficult job. I think councillors working in a very challenging environment at the moment, with all of what we understand and the political environment. It's very difficult and sometimes can be a thankless task. So I want to recognise very much the work they do. On the point about citizen involvement in the budget, I think we've worked to try and improve people's understanding of kind of how it works, how we reach the development of a budget, and we've heard a wide range of views from stakeholders across Scotland, from very diverse communities. We've heard the priorities of third sector, public sector, business sectors, and communities at large. We have tried to produce information that has been public-facing. So following a review of international best practice on citizens' budgets, we enhanced our guide to the Scottish budget called Your Scotland, Your Finances, and it's now produced alongside the draft Scottish budget publication, and it's updated to reflect the finalised Scottish budget agreed by Parliament, and updates on budget revisions agreed in year by the Parliament as well. I mean, it is a complicated system because you have the in-year revisions, spring and autumn. It is not a straightforward process, but I think through that publication and the updating of it, we've tried to set out how it works in straightforward terms. I think we recognise there's more to do, and we want to make those improvements, which is why last year's budget document signposts the 27 supporting budget documents and associated publications that accompanied the 25-26 budget. Now, I don't expect there'll be many folk who have read every one of those from cover to cover, present company accepted, of course. But we try to then go from that to the your Scotland, Your Finances, to provide a much kind of snappier way of producing information about something that's actually very complex. So that's the attempts we've made. It's work in progress. There's more to do, but we have recognised that we need to try and, because we want people to think about the budget. We want people to be involved as much as they can be, and to give their views on both process and outcome as well.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And I have questions from Paul McLennan, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. And it's kind of just to build on the accountability side of things. We had a session with CAN members just last week, and one of the things they talked about was their lived experience, and obviously collaboration with service users when they were designing services. I think one of the key things, and I used this quote earlier on in the earlier panel, was around about from one of the members of CAN, was one of the biggest challenges we faced was ensuring our voices translated into meaningful influence. While our panel's question put to the Minister, it was evident that those translating into real change requires persistence, transparency and stronger accountability mechanisms. And accountability wasn't so much on the Scottish Government, more on Scottish Government's partners. So how can we ensure that the partners are delivering what the Government's objectives are, and the voice, obviously, of those with lived experience is reflected in that delivery by the partners, and that was one of the key points that was really raised by Karen last week. So probably I just maybe to the Minister first and then the Cab Sec after that.
Yeah, I can come in briefly on that. I suppose the way it works is that, we give money to sort of like partners, strategic delivery partners who undertake that work because they are the ones that are best placed. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise, and usually they have the voice of lived experience within that. I suppose one example I could give is the Scottish Refugee Council, for instance. Now, the funds, so the procurement process is that when the grant offer sort of like letters go out, there is a clear, the contract is very clear of what services we expect to be delivered. And then we have both internal and external organisations that monitor that and analyse it and make sure that all the processes are followed. For instance, I think, I always get it confused, forgive me, Inspire. Inspire, yes, it is Inspire, that sort of like, now they've got over 17 years worth of experience in this, they're incredibly experienced. So they do regular sort of like checks and balances to make sure that the money that we are sort of like providing, that is being used for the purposes that it is meant to be being used. And if it is not, there are, like any contract, that there would be, there are ways of sort of like managing that. Yeah.
Just to come back on that one, Minister, and I suppose for the Cab Sec as well, I suppose it's that data was one of the key things as well, and data is different in different parts of the country as well, because when we spoke to Karen last week, one of the things we talked about, it may be applicable for services that are available in Edinburgh and Glasgow, but may be different in terms of services that are available in Highlands, for example. So it's really just to try and tie in where the lived experience is, and also then looking at the data that's available and how often is that then taken into consideration to make sure if things are changing, that policy also follows that in terms of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the current equality evidence strategy is there. That seeks to make improvements to the availability and the analysis of equality data across the Scottish Government, and that is running till December 2025. And of course, work is underway to develop the next iteration of that. The Equality Evidence Finder, that's a web-based platform that's established to disseminate that equality data to analysts, to policymakers, and of course to the general public. It's all there. And work is underway to advance the data included in the tool and to improve its accessibility and usability, because I understand that just because the data is there doesn't mean to say that everybody is able to access it equally. So we are working on that. I think that we have seen good progress on that. Obviously, there's always more to do and to refine it. But the current evidence strategy, which ran from 2023 to, of course, December 2025, and an evaluation of that strategy alongside the collaboration with analysts, policymakers and externals, well, that's going to directly inform that next iteration that I was talking about. So that's happening in live time, in real time. I hope that gives...
Yeah. And just on that one, Cabinet Secretary, I suppose it's just kind of expanding that, obviously, for where your responsibility is sitting. One of the examples that was used this morning was around about the government's focus and success on child poverty in terms of that. So how does that almost determine the broader overview of budget? Because budget spending just doesn't sit in one silo, if you like. It has to be that more broader policy approach. So from your point of view, obviously looking at that broader approach, where does use of data come in from your point of view in terms of and the lived experience and how that's combined? Yeah,
well, child poverty is a good example because, well, it's a statutory duty. So this isn't a nice to do. This is, Parliament passed a law that we would meet the child poverty targets, and therefore the work that's going on of the next delivery plan is to set out Well, first of all, the analysis and the analytics of the data of where we are is important. So where is the base now? And progress has been made on child poverty, but we need to do more in order to close the gap to 2030. So that ongoing analysis and use of data is really important to know whether we're on track to meet the requirements by 2030. And then it is about being able to use that as drivers, and also to test whether the policies that we're enacting to close that gap are working. So Scottish Child Payment, I think there's a lot of evidence and data that shows it has been probably the single most important tool. But the investment in housing, for example, the investment in childcare, the investment in transport, employability, is a little less direct, because it's not about money in people's pockets per se. It has a value, but it's not about money in people's pockets. So, the data, it's important the data is there and able to be captured around, well, what impact or reduced housing costs make on a household income to help reduce poverty, what impact of a flexible childcare service, how does that help the family to reduce costs? And then there's employability, because we know that work is the best way out of poverty, and ensuring that our programmes are supporting parents in all of their in shapes and forms that parents and families come in. So the 6 priority groups are a real focus for this next delivery plan. And the data is really important. It's important for us to know if we're making progress, but it's also important for scrutiny. And there's a lot of external scrutiny on progress on the child poverty target. So it's a good example of where we're probably more advanced, because it is the single most important objective that First Minister has set out in terms of eradication of child poverty and the statutory targets. So hopefully that gives you assurance that we use data very a lot. We value it. It is crucial. Otherwise, how are we measuring objectively the progress that we're making?
Thanks, Camille.
Okay, thank you. Just to remind our witnesses and our members, we are running a bit over time now. We still have a question from Pam Gossel and Tess, you've indicated as well. If there are any other members who feel that they wish to ask any more questions, if they could indicate, and just to say if we could make it as succinct as possible, so we don't go too far over time. I appreciate that. Thank you. We'll go to Pam Gossel now, please.
Thank you, Convener. I think mine may have been answered, so you may be lucky here, but it'd be good to hear a little bit more. So last week, obviously, we had the private session, and the whole Family Equality Project spoke about money being wasted year after year sometimes, and that was because there was no multi-year budgeting in place. So sometimes what happens is, when money's given out to a programme, they were saying that it takes a whole year to get familiar with this programme, to set it up, to work at it, and then before you know, the second year, the money disappears. And that was something that was highlighted, that to ask the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister about that. Do you agree that we need to have multi-year settlements in that, or especially on the budgeting? But I did hear earlier on from the Cabinet Secretary, if I'm not wrong, that you are implementing multi-year budgeting. Is that right? If you can tell me a little bit more about that.
So we're delivering against our commitment to develop what we described as a fairer funding approach by providing more multi-year funding to third sector organisations delivering frontline services and particularly tackling child poverty. So as part of the 25-26 programme for government, we committed to what was described as a fairer funding pilot that provided multi-year funding to a range of third sector organisations, totalling about £130 million over 25-26 and 26-27, and that supports projects in areas including health, education, justice, poverty, culture. And it is the first step towards, I guess, what you describe as mainstreaming multi-year funding agreements, because we know that, and I hear this all the time from the third sector, sometimes certainty is as important or more important than quantity of having that line of sight of knowing what you're getting, because you can hold on to staff. You don't have to work on a year to year. Now, to be fair, to Scottish Government, we had been subject for many years to single-year budgets ourselves, and that makes it quite difficult to then guarantee funding to other organisations when you don't know what the funding you're going to have yourself. But if we're now into a multi-year, we've had a multi-year spending review from UK Government, and that is why we set out that we're going to have a spending review alongside the 26-27 budget, which will allow us to look at providing as much as possible that line of sight of multi-year funding, which is only fair in terms of the spending review. So I am keen to go further. I think it is really, really important, particularly when money is tight. And we know for the third sector, it helps them to hold on to key people that deliver such vital services. So hopefully that gives you some reassurance.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. This is around the final theme of the third sector and accountability. So my colleague talked about accountability and who is responsible. And there's a big emphasis on lived experience, but I'll just give the example of an accountant. An accountant can have lived experience of accounts, but it doesn't make a formally qualified accountant. And so in terms of delegation of accountability in the third sector, I've got 3 questions, Convener. And my first question is around an organisation. Scottish Trans, for example, is an organisation funded by the SNP government and has publicly argued that men can breastfeed babies despite the risks to the infant and the risks of synthetic hormone-induced secretions. And it hasn't been clinically trialled because of the risks. And pregnant and breastfeeding women face huge restrictions on what they can eat and drink. And a recent example one mother gave me was pregnant women can't even have a Lemsip Max. So if pregnant women are being told there are restrictions on what they can eat and drink and put into their bodies, Scottish Trans is advocating for a process which uses synthetic hormones, and it openly criticises the EHRC for a perceived lack of protection for men who want to quote-unquote breastfeed. And the whole thing, Minister and Cabinet Secretary, is unsafe and it's completely bonkers. So earlier in my question, I referenced the cuts to breastfeeding support services for women because of the SNP government funding decisions. So my question is, why are ministers continuing to fund Scottish Trans, given its position is undermining health and safety and evidence-based policy making?
So I'm going to hand over to the Minister on the specific, but can I just put on the record that the funding to our health boards and our local authorities has indeed increased. So it's not cuts to funding, they have increased in real terms. And that's not just me. We talked about scrutiny and accountability. So the Accounts Commission and Audit Scotland have confirmed that, that both in terms of local government and in terms of health and social care funding, both have increased in real terms. So we should be accurate to say, that doesn't mean that there are not difficult decisions to be made around where funding goes, but that has increased in real terms because of the decision we made to increase health and social care funding considerably in the 25-26 budget. So it's important just to put that on the record. Funding has increased, not decreased. Can I don't know, do you want to come in on the specific in terms of the funding?
So, I mean, sort of... I think with regards to funding, I did go over sort of like, how and why we procure services. And I think in previous sessions it has been raised, I think maybe it was yourself that raised that in the past, of conflating. So different organisations provide different services. Some of them are campaigners that they do as well. But I have made it very, very clear in the past that the organisations that we fund them for specific services that they provide. And some of them may undertake campaigning work, they may not. None of that is funded by the Scottish Government in any way whatsoever. And generally speaking, sort of like organisations are providing services such as information, they are gathering data, they are living, so listening to the voices of lived experience, providing suicide helplines, informing sort of like policy in the future. So they are undertaking very valuable work. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. And I refer to the 6th of May. So on the 6th of May, you and your official, Kat McMeekan, gave evidence to this committee. It was on the 6th of May, and she responded to my questions regarding funding for third sector organisations supported by the Equality and Human Rights Fund. And Ms McMeekan stated then that the Scottish Government, and I quote from the official report, the Scottish Government does not provide core funding which is for the wider lobbying activities that organisations do. It is much more about giving funding for specific services, which is what you've just said, Minister. So my question is, why then does the fund manager Inspiring Scotland specifically include a list of the advocacy work carried out by the Equality Network, Leap Sports Scotland, LGBT Youth Scotland, LGBT Healthy Living Centre and Stonewall on gender identity services in a recent progress report on the Equality and Human Rights Fund? Now, that's a specific question, Minister. And if you don't know, I'm happy to follow up with you separately.
Well, I'll have a go. And if there's anything left, I'm happy to follow up with you as well on that. I think, yeah, I mean, Kat McMeekan was correct, and I have reinforced that. One of the sort of like services that is provided is advocacy work, because often the most marginalised people are not in a place to be able to represent themselves. So they do need, somebody advocating for them. For instance, the Scottish Refugee Council, the sort of like the contract that they have just been awarded to assist migrants, for instance, those are some of the most vulnerable people that are not able, they're not able to access their rights and get access to sort of housing or the benefits or indeed healthcare. So I think it's important to remember that the principle applies across all protected characteristics, and trans people being trans is a protected characteristic. So they would be and should be entitled to the same services as any other protected characteristic.
And I hear you, Minister, and I'm not disputing what you say about organisations like the Scottish Refugee Funding Council and making sure that people who are the most marginalised have a voice. But this committee is about scrutiny and accountability, and today's session is about accountability, and you can't delegate accountability. So my final question, it's been recently reported that since 2017, the SNP government has given £20 million handout from the public purse, taxpayer money, to third sector organisations that support self-ID. So my question to you, Minister, is will Scottish ministers and also to the Cabinet Secretary commit to working with Inspiring Scotland and other relevant parties to withdraw funding from groups that promote unlawful policies? And these policies that they're promoting are not only some of them unsafe, but unlawful.
We will continue to work with our partners in Inspiring Scotland. We have a well-established relationship with them. I think that in response to the member's answer, I will just give out of the budget that comes out of my portfolio, the Equality and Human Rights Fund, for instance. It might be helpful for you to be aware that 31% of my total budget is spent on disability organisations and supporting those with disabilities. 22% of that budget is spent on advancing race equality and in the wider field. Women and girls, the budget is also 22%. 14%, which the least amount is actually spent on supporting organisations that work within the LGBTQI arena. So I hope that that gives you an indication of the proportion of the money that is spent.
Minister, you haven't answered the question. The question is, and you said earlier that you will be looking at organisations that are not actually spending the money where you have directed that they spend the money, which is laudable and is very important because it's taxpayer money. But when you're talking of £20 million, the question was, will you make sure that funding is withdrawn from organisations that are breaking the law? And if you have Inspiring Scotland, will you ask Inspiring Scotland, who are your fund manager, to make sure they do a stock check of those organisations that are breaking the law? That's the question.
Well, organisations of any type will only get funding if they deliver what the funding is for. And the Minister has outlined that there is a difference between services being provided, like suicide helplines, for example, and the advocacy or policy position of any organisation. And there are numerous organisations that may have policy positions on the one hand where no funding goes towards any of that, but they provide a very discreet, important, practical support like a suicide prevention helpline. So I think that's the distinction that the Minister has made, and every organisation is subject and should be subject to scrutiny by Inspiring Scotland and then in turn obviously government to make sure that the funding that they're provided with goes on the services that they've said the money is for, and that will continue.
And I hear just the previous session we heard from the Scottish Human Rights Commission when they talked about quality assurance. So the question is, does the Scottish Government, and you're the Cabinet Secretary and we've got the Minister here, will you ensure that those organisations that you fund have the quality assurance that they're not operating unlawfully? And that's my final question.
So the quality assurance of making sure that any funding going to any organisation is spent on the services that they're supposed to be providing will be done by those intermediaries that are paid to do that job, and that is what they will do. And if an organisation is not spending the money on what they're supposed to spend it on, then that of course would be relayed to ministers, and that's when ministers would become involved. So that is how the process
Minister,
works.
That's a different answer to the question I asked.
That's the answer that I'm giving you.
I'll pass back to the convener. Thank you.
Thank you. That does bring us to a close of this panel. I want to thank everyone for their participation in this. It's been really valuable for the committee to undertake our scrutiny of human rights budgeting. We have a lot of information to take away. Thank you to the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister for giving us your time today to be able to do some of our accountability work on that too, and we will be in touch with the committee's recommendations going forward. We will now go into private to discuss the remaining items on our agenda. Thank you.